Prologue. Initially there was an individual called Winston Duarte. And then there wasn't. The last instant had been Bano. He'd been in his personal study, at the heart of the state building. Positioned on his divan, his desk, Laconian rainwood with a grain like sedimentary rock, had an inset screen, displaying the 1,000 different reports. Vying for his attention, the mechanism of the Dominion ground. Slowly forward with every revolution of the wheel, making the mechanism a little smoother and more precise. He'd been reviewing the surveillance documents from Oberon, where the governor, responding to separatist violence, had begun enlisting inhabitants into the system. Surveillance forces, his own daughter Teresa, had been on one of her unauthorized adventures. Beyond the grounds, the solitary nature hikes, which she believed to be beyond the watchful eye of Laconian security, were developmentally crucial for her, and he looked on them not only with indulgence, but pride. He'd only lately informed her about his ambitions, for her to join him as Paula Cortas's second patient, to have her awareness opened and deepened, as his had been, to live perhaps not forever, but at least indefinitely. 100 years from now, they would still be guiding the human dominion. 1,000. 10,000 years, if that was the terrible pressure behind it all, the overwhelming if he could push back against the human habit of complacence, if he could convince the vast, incoherent scrum that was humanity, that they had to take action to avoid the fate of their predecessors. Either they did whatever it took to understand and defeat the darkness on the third side of the ring gate, or they died at its hand. The experiments and Tacoma system were, like all the critical steps that had come throughout human history ever since the initially mammal decided to rise on its hind legs to see above the grass. If it worked, it would change everything again. Everything changed everything that had come before. It was the least surprising thing in life. He had reached for his tea in those last moments, but noticed through one of the weird new senses Dr. Cortisser had given him, that the pot had already gone cold. The awareness of molecular vibration was analogous to the physical sensation of heat. It measured the same material reality, but the merely human sense was like a child playing a whistle compared with Duarte's vast, symphonic new awareness. The last instant came, in the instant between deciding to call his valet for a fresh pot of tea and then reaching his hand out for the comm controls. The mind of Winston Duarte blew apart, like a pile of straw in a hurricane. There was pain, a great deal of pain, and there was fear. But there wasn't anyone left to feel it, so it faded quickly. There was no consciousness, no pattern. No one to think the thoughts that swelled and dimmed. Something more delicate, more graceful, more sophisticated would have died, the narrative chain that thought of itself as Winston Duarte was ripped to pieces. But the flesh that housed him wasn't. The subtle flows of energy in his body fell into a storm of invisible turbulence, whipped past coherence. And then, without anyone being aware of it, they began to slow and still. His 30 trillion cells still took in oxygen from the complex fluid that had been his blood, those structures that were his neurons fell into association with each other, like drinking badas, bending their elbows in unconscious synchrony. Something was that hadn't been, not the old thing, but a pattern that took up residence in the empty space. It left behind, not the dancer, but a dance, not the water, but a whirlpool, not a person, not a mind, but something. When awareness returned, it initially appeared in colors, blue but without the words for blueness. Then red, then a white that also meant something. The fragment of an idea. Snow. Joy came to be, and it lasted longer than fear had. A deep bubbling sense of wonder carried itself along without anything to carry it. Patterns rose and fell, came together and came apart. The few that fell apart more slowly sometimes came into relationship with each other, and sometimes that made them last even longer, like a baby slowly mapping touch and sight and kinesthesis into something not yet called foot. Scraps of awareness touched the universe, and something like understanding began to form. Something felt its own lumbering, brute physicality as it pushed chemicals into the vast gaps between cells. It felt the raw, open vibration that surrounded the ring gates, that connected the worlds, and it thought of sores and ulcerations. It felt something, it thought something. It remembered how to remember, and then it forgot. There had been a reason ago. Something had justified atrocities. In order to avoid worse ones, he had betrayed his nation. He had conspired against billions. He had condemned people who were loyal to him to death. There had been a reason. He remembered it. He forgot. He rediscovered the glorious brilliance of yellow and devoted himself to the pure experience of that. He heard voices as symphonies. He heard them as quacks. He was surprised to find that he existed, and that it was him. There was something he was supposed to do. Save humanity, something ridiculously grand like that. He forgot. Come back, Daddy, come back to me. Like when she'd been a baby, and he had slept at her side. He refocused on her by habit. His daughter muled, and he roused himself so that his wife wouldn't have to. His hand was in hers. She'd said something. He couldn't remember the words. So he looked backward in time to where she spoke them. Dr. Kurtasa, he's going to kill me. That didn't seem right. He didn't know why. The storm in the other place was loud, and soft and loud that was connected. He was supposed to save them from the things in the storm that were the storm, or from their own to human nature. But his daughter was there, and she was interesting. He could see the distress flowing through her brain, through her body. The pain in her blood centered the air around her. And he wanted to soothe her, to comfort her. He wanted to make right everything that was wrong for her. But more interesting for the initially time, he wanted the strange sensation of feeling these things. Plucked at his focus, and his focus drifted. He held her hand and wondered. When he came back, he was still holding her hand, but she was someone else. We just need to skin you, sir. It won't hurt. He remembered Dr. Katasa. He's going to kill me. He waved Cortusa away, pushing at the empty spaces between the tiny motes that made him a physical thing, until the individual swirled like dust there. That was fixed. But the effort tired him and made his body ache. He gave himself permission to drift. But even so, he noticed that the drift was less. His nervous system was shattered, but it kept growing together. His body kept insisting that even if it couldn't go on, it could go on. He admired this stubborn refusal to die, as if it was something beyond of himself, the sheer mindless and physical impulse to move forward, each cell's determination to churn along, the object need to continue existing that didn't even require a will. All of it meant something. It was important. He just had to remember how. It had to do with his daughter. It had to do with keeping her safe and well. He remembered. He remembered being an individual who loved his child. And so he remembered being a man, and that was a stronger rope than the ambition that had built an empire. He remembered that he had made himself something different than a human, something more, and he understood how this alien strength had also weakened him, how the brutish and unapologetic clay of his body had kept him from annihilation. The sword that slew 1 billion angels had only inconvenience. The primates in their bubbles of metal and air, and an individual called Winston Duarte. Halfway between angel and ape had been broken, but not killed. The shards had found their own way. There was someone else too. An individual with dry river beds in his mind. Another individual who had been changed. James Holden, the enemy. who had shared his enemy back before Winston Duarte, had broken and in breaking become. With infinite effort and care, he pulled the unbearable vastness and complexity of his awareness in, compressing himself into what he had been. The blue faded into the color he had known as a man, the sense of the storm raging. Just on the other side of the violence and threat faded. He felt the warm, iron-smelling meat of his hand holding nothing. He opened his eyes, turned to the comm controls, and opened a connection. "Kelly," he said, "could you bring me a fresh pot of tea?" The pause was less than might have been expected. Under the circumstances, "Yes, sir," Kelly said. "Thank you." Duarte dropped the connection. A medical bed had been put in his study, with an aerated foam mattress to prevent bed sores. But he was seated at his desk, as if he had never left it. He took stock of his body, noticing its weakness, the thinness of its muscles. He stood, clasped his hands behind him, and walked to the window to see whether he could. He could. Beyond a light tapping rain was falling. There were puddles on the walkways, and the grass was bright and clean. He reached out for Teresa, and he found her. She wasn't nearby, but she wasn't in distress. It was like watching her trips to the wilds again, only without the artificial lens of the cameras. His love and indulgence for her was vast, oceanic, but it wasn't pressing. The truest expression of his love was his work. And so he turned to it as if this were any other day. Duarte pulled up an executive summary, the way he had at the start of every morning. Normally it was a page long. This one was a full volume. He sorted by category, pulling out the thread that addressed the status of traffic through the ring space. Things had, putting it mildly, gone poorly in his absence. Scientific documents of the loss of Medina Station and the typhoon, military analyses of the siege of Laconia, the loss of the construction platforms, intelligent summaries of the growing opposition in the widely scattered systems of humanity and of Admiral Trejo's attempts to hold the dream of the empire together without him. There'd been a time not long after her mother passed, when Teresa had decided to make him breakfast. She had been so young, so incapable that she had failed. He remembered the crust of bread, heaping with jam, and a pat of unmelted butter perched on top of it. The combination of ambition and affection and pathos had been beautiful in its way. It was the kind of memory that survived because the love and the embarrassment fit together so perfectly. This felt the same. His awareness of the ring space was clear now. He could hear the echoes of it in the fabric of reality, like he was pressing his ear to a ship's deck to know the status of its drive. The rage of the enemy was as apparent to him now, as if he could hear its voices, the shrieks that tore something that wasn't air in something that wasn't time. "Admiral Trejo," he said, and Anton startled. It was the 5th week of Trejo's combination press tour and reconquest of Sol System. He sat in his cabin, spent from his long day of glad handing and speech-making with the local leaders and officials. He was the visible face of a nearly toppled empire, making sure no one knew how close he'd come to losing it all. After the hard weeks-long burnout from Laconia, it was exhausting. He wanted nothing more than a stiff drink and 8 hours in his bed, or 20. Instead, he was on a video call with Secretary General Douche and his Martian counterpart, both of them on Luna, and near enough that light delay didn't interfere. The politicians were lying through their smiles. Trejo was threatening through his, "Of course we understand the necessity of getting the orbital shipyards up and running as quickly as possible. Rebuilding our shared defenses is critical," Douche said. "But given the lawlessness that has followed the recent attack on Laconia, our initially concern is surveillance for the facilities. We have to have some guarantee that your ships will be able to protect these valuable assets. We don't just want to paint a target on ourselves. For the underground AMAT, you just got the shit kicked out of you. had your factories blown up, lost 2 of your most powerful battleships, and are scrambling to hold the Dominion together. Do you have enough ships to force us to work for you? We've suffered setbacks, that's true, Treyo drooled, the way he sometimes did when he was angry. But there's no need for concern. We have more than enough of the Pulsar-class destroyers to provide total security for Sol System. I just reconquered you with 24 of those ships, and I have a shit ton more of them. I can call in if I need to. So fucking do what I tell you to do. Excellent to hear that, the Martian Prime Minister said. Please let the High Council know. We will spare no effort to meet his production schedule. Please don't carpet bomb our cities. I will let him know, Treyo replied. The High Council treasures your support and loyalty. Duarte is a drooling moron, but if you give me the ships to hold the Empire together, I won't have to glass your damn planets. And maybe we all win. Treyo killed the connection and leaned back in his chair. The bottle of whiskey in his cabinet called to him. Gently, the freshly made bed was much louder. He had time for neither. The underground was still running riot, and 13 systems and more, and that was just his human problem. After that, there were the gates to deal with, and whatever within them kept turning the mines off, and whole systems at a time, as it sniffed for ways to exterminate humanity. No rest for the wicked, no peace for the good. Connect me to the Association of Worlds Rap Sol System. I don't remember her name, he said. No one heard him but the ship. Connecting now flashed on his screen. Time for more smiling lies, more veiled threats, more. And he used the word as an epithet: diplomacy. Admiral Treyo said, a voice from behind him. It was familiar, but so unexpected that his mind scrambled to place it. It had a brief irrational idea, that is, Attaché had been hiding in his room this whole time, and had only just now chosen to reveal himself. Anton, the voice said, lower and as intimate as a friend. Treyo turned around in his chair to face the room. Winston Duarte stood near the foot of his bed, hands behind his back. He wore a loose casual shirt and black trousers. He wasn't wearing any shoes. His hair was mussed as if he'd only lately woken up. He looked like he was actually there. Surveillance alert, Treyo said. This room full sweep. Duarte looked pained. Anton, he said again, in milliseconds. The ship had swept every inch of his cabin, looking for anyone or anything that wasn't supposed to be there. His screen reported to him that the room was free of listening devices, dangerous chemicals, unauthorized technology. He was also the only person in it. The ship asked if he wanted armed surveillance personnel to respond. Am I having a stroke? He asked the apparition. No, Duarte said, though you should probably be getting more sleep. The ghost in his room shrugged its shoulders, almost apologetically. Look, Anton, you've done everything that could have been asked of you to hold the Dominion together. I've seen the reports. I know how difficult this job has been. You're not here, Treyo said, asserting the only possible reality against the lies his senses were telling him. What's here means has become strangely flexible for me. Duarte agreed. As much as I appreciate your work, you can stand down now. No, it's not over. I'm still fighting to hold the Dominion together, and I appreciate that, I do, but we've been running down the wrong road. I need a little quiet to think this through, but I see things better now. It's going to be all right. The need to hear those words, to believe them, rushed through Treyo like a flood. The initially time a lover had kissed him, it had been less overwhelming than this. Duarte shook an amused and melancholy smile. We built a Dominion that spanned the galaxy. You and I, who'd have imagined we were thinking too small? The image illusion projection, whatever it was, vanished so suddenly. It was like a skipped frame in a film. Fuck me, Treyo said to no one. The surveillance alert was still flashing on the screen over his desk. He slapped the calm link with one hand. "Sir," the duty officer said, "we've got an active alert from your quarters. Do you want?" "You have 5 minutes to prep." "For a max burn to the ring, sir," sound the alarm Trejo said. "And get everyone in their couches. We have to get back to Laconia now." Chapter 1. Jim, hit Pingus, Alex said. His voice was a light, almost sing-song that meant he thought they were screwed. Jim positioned on the ops deck, with a tactical map of Chronos system on the screen, and his heart going double time. Tried to disagree. Just because he's knocking doesn't mean he knows who's home. Let's keep acting like what we're acting like. The Rocinante was acting like a small hull freighter, a class of ship thick on the ground in Chronos system. Naomi had tuned the Epstein to run just dirty, enough to change their drive signature without generating too much extra waste heat. A set of extra plating welded to their hull at an underground shipyard in Harris system had altered their silhouette. A slow dribble of liquid hydrogen was pumping out across the top of the ship and changing their thermal profile when Naomi had gone over. The plan to layer on camouflage, it seemed comprehensive. It was only the threat of violence that made Jim feel exposed. The enemy frigate was called the Black Kite, smaller than the Storm-class destroyers. It was still well-armed and had the self-healing outer hull that made Laconian ships hard to kill. It was part of a hunting group, scouring all the inhabited systems for Teresa Duarte, runaway daughter of High Consul Winston Duarte, heir apparent to his dominion and for the time being apprentice mechanic on the Rocinante. This wasn't the initially time they'd seen it. "Any follow-up?" Jim asked. "Just the LADAR ping," Alex said. "Think I should warm up the pea shooter just in case?" "Yeah, let's do that," was on the edge of Jim's mind, when Naomi's voice answered instead. "No, there's some evidence that their next-generation sensor arrays can recognize rail gun capacitors. That feels unfair," Jim said. "What a crew does with its rail gun capacitor in the privacy of its own ship shouldn't be anyone else's business." He could hear the smile and Naomi's voice. "While I agree in principle, let's keep the guns offline until we need them." "Copy that," Alex said. "Still no follow-up?" Jim asked, even though he had access to all the same logs Alex did. Alex checked anyway. Comms are dark. Chronos wasn't quite a dead system, but it was close. The star there was large and fast-burning. There had been a habitable planet in the Goldilocks zone there at one point, at least enough that the proto-molecule had been able to hijack the biomass needed to build a ring gate, but in the strange eon since the gate's formation and humanity's stumbling into the alien ruins, the Goldilocks zone had moved. The original life-bearing planet hadn't quite been engulfed by the star yet, but its oceans had been boiled to nothing, and its atmosphere stripped away. The only native life in Chronos was on the wet moon of an outlying gas giant, and that wasn't much more than viciously competing, continent-sized sheets of slime mold. The human inhabitants of Chronos were around 10,000 miners on 732 active sites, corporations, government-sponsored interest groups, independent rock hoppers, and unholy legal hybrids of all three were stripping palladium out of a nussly, rich scattering of asteroids and sending it out to anyone still building air recyclers or working on adjustment terraforming projects, which was everyone. Chronos had been the edge of the transport union's reach back in the day, then the ascent of the Laconian Empire, and now no one really knew what it was. There were hundreds of systems like it, all through the gate network, places that either weren't self-sufficient yet, or didn't plan to be, more focused on digging out their own little economic niche than any broader coalition. The kinds of places where the underground could usually hide and repair their ships and plan for what came next. On the tactical map, asteroids marked by orbit, survey status, composition, and legal ownership. swirled around the angry star as thick as pollen. In springtime, the ships were clumped around. The excavation and survey sites, by the dozen, and as many more were on lonely transits, from one little outpost to another, or on errands to gather water for reaction, mass and radiation shielding. The black kite had come through the ring gate 3 days before, torpedoed the underground's radio repeater at the surface of the gate, and then burned gently to remain in place, like a bouncer at a pretentious nightclub. The ring gates didn't orbit the stars so much as remain in fixed position, as though they'd been hung on hooks in the vacuum. It wasn't the strangest thing about them, Jim had let himself hoped. That blowing up the underground's pirate transmitter would be all the kite did, that the enemy would finish its little vandalism and fuck off to cut the metaphorical telegraph wires. On some other system, it had stayed scanning the system looking for them. For Teresa, for Naomi, functional leader of the underground. And for him, the calm display lit up, the green of an incoming transmission. And Jim's gut nodded at their present range. The battle wouldn't come for hours, but the rush of adrenaline was like someone had fired a gun. The fear was so present and overwhelming that he didn't notice anything. Odd broadcast Alex said over. The ship comes, and from the deck above Jim, weird as not a type beam. I don't think he's talking to us. Jim opened the channel. The woman's voice had a clipped, emotionless formality that was like the accent of the Laconian military. As offensive action and treated as such, message repeats. This is the black kite to registered freighter. Perishable harvest by order of Laconian surveillance forces. You will cut your drive and prepare for boarding and inspection. Refusal to comply will be reviewed as an offensive action and treated as such. Message repeats. Jim filtered the tactical map. The perishable harvest was about 30 degrees. Spinward of the rosy and burning toward the wide. Angry sun, if they'd gotten the message. They hadn't complied with it yet. Is that one of ours? Jim asked. Nope. Naomi said it's listed as property of a David Calrissian out of Baragon. I don't know anything about it. With light delay, they should have received the Black Kite's command 10 minutes before the Rosinante did. Jim imagined some other crew in a panic because they'd received the message. He'd been dreading whatever happened next. The Rosinante was out of the crosshairs, for the instant at least. He wished he could feel the relief a little more deeply. Jim unstrapped from the crash couch and swung around. The bearings hissed as it shifted under his weight. I'm heading down to the galley for a minute, he said. Grab a coffee for me too, Alex said. No, not coffee. I may be up to some chamomile or warm milk. Something soothing and unaggressive. Sounds good, Alex said. When you change your mind and get some coffee, grab one for me too. On the lift, Jim leaned against the wall and waited for his heart to stop racing. This was how heart attacks came, wasn't it? A pulse that started fast and then never slowed, until something critical popped that was probably wrong. But it felt that way. He felt that way all the time. It was getting better, easier. The auto dog had been able to supervise the regrowth of his missing teeth, apart from the indignity of needing to numb his gums. Like a toddler that had gone well enough, the nightmares were old acquaintances by now. It started having them on Laconia, while still a prisoner of High Consul Duarte. He'd expected them to fade once he was free, but they were getting worse. Being buried alive was the most recent version. More often it was someone he loved, being murdered in the next room, and not being able to key in the lock code fast enough to save them, or having a parasite living under his skin and trying to find a way to cut it out, or the guards in Laconia coming to beat him, until his teeth broke again, the way that they had, on the upside. The old dreams about forgetting to put on his clothes, or not studying for a test, seemed to be off the rotation. His weirdly vindictive dream life wasn't all bad. There were still days when he couldn't shake the sense of threat. Sometimes, a part of his mind would get trapped in the unfounded and irrational certainty that his Laconian torture team was about to find him again. Others, it was the less irrational dread of the things beyond the gates, the apocalypse, that destroyed the proto-molecules makers and was on the path to destroying humanity. Seen in that light, maybe he wasn't the broken part of the equation. Maybe the larger situation was bad enough. That feeling as whole and sane as the individual he'd been before his Laconian imprisonment would have been a sign of madness. Still, he wished he could tell whether the waves of shuddering were a resonance effect of running the drive dirty, or if it was just him. The lift stopped, and he stepped out, turning toward the galley. The soft, rhythmic thump of dog tail against deck informed him. Teresa and Muskrat were already there, Amos black-eyed. Gray-skinned and back from the dead was there too, positioned at the table, with the same placeholder smile he'd always had. Jim hadn't seen him shot in the head back on Laconia, but he knew about the drones that had taken the pieces of human flesh and reconnected them. Naomi still struggled with weather. The thing that called itself Amos really was the mechanic they chipped with for so many years, or if he'd become an alien mechanism that only thought it was Amos because it was made from his body and brain. Jim had decided that even if he looked different, even if he sometimes knew things that were scraps of the ancient alien world, Amos was Amos. He didn't have the spare energy to think about it more deeply than that. Besides which, the dog liked him, not a perfect critical guide, but probably the least imperfect. Muskrat, positioned at Teresa's feet, looked up at Jim hopefully and wagged her tail against the deck again. "I don't have any sausage," Jim said to the expressive brown eyes. "You'll have to make do with kibble like the rest of us. You spoiled her," Teresa said. "She's never letting you forget that, if I go to heaven." "Let it be for spoiling dogs and children," Jim said, and headed for the dispenser. Without thinking, he keyed in a bowl of coffee. Then, realizing what he'd done, he added one for Alex. Teresa Duarte shrugged and turned her focus back to the tube of mushroom flavorings and digestive fiber. That was her breakfast. Her hair was pulled back in a dark ponytail, and her mouth had a permanent slight frown. That was either a quirk of her physiology or her character. Jim had seen her grow from a precocious child to a rebellious adolescent in the state building in Laconia. She was 15 now, and it was sobering to remember who he'd been at her age, a thin, dark-haired Montana boy with no particular ambitions, beyond the knowledge that, if nothing else worked out, he could join the Navy. Teresa seemed older than adolescent. Jim had been both more knowledgeable about the universe and angrier with it. Maybe the two went hand in hand. She'd been afraid of him when he'd been her father's prisoner. Now that she was on Jim's ship, the fear seemed to have evaporated. He'd been her enemy then, but he wasn't sure that he was her friend now. The emotional complexity of an adolescent girl, socialized in isolation, was probably more than he could ever really understand. The dispenser finished both his bulb and Alex's, and Jim took them, appreciating the warmth against his palms. The shuddering was almost gone now, and the bitterness of the coffee was more calming than tea would have been. "We're going to need a resupply before much longer," Amy said. "Really, we're okay on water, but we could stand to re-up the fuel pellets. And the recyclers ain't what they used to be." "How bad was solid for a few weeks yet?" Amos said. Jim nodded. His initial impulse was to dismiss it as a problem for another day. That was wrong though. Fuck it. If it's not happening right now, was crisis thinking. And if he couldn't break out of it, it would only lead to more crises later on. "I'll talk to Naomi," he said. "We'll figure something out." assuming the Laconians don't find us, assuming the gate entities don't kill us, assuming that any of the 1,000 other catastrophes. I haven't even thought of, don't kill us all before it matters. He took another sip of his coffee. How you doing, Captain? Amos said, you seem a little twitchy. Fine, Jim said. Just covering near constant panic with light humor. Same as anyone, Amos had an instant of eerie stillness. One of the hallmarks of his new self. And then smiled a little wider. All right then. Alex broke in over the ship comms. We've got something good. Something, Alex said. The perishable harvest just dumped some kind of liquid. And it's burning like hell. For the big trade station in the outer belt. Copy that, Naomi said. Also over the comms in the news. Takato. Com that Jim thought of as her Commander Nagata voice. Confirming the black kite, Jim asked the wall. Alex and Naomi were silent for a moment. Then Alex said, looks like they're going after them, moving away from the ring gate. Yes, indeed, Alex said, and the pleasure in his voice was unmistakable. Jim felt a surge of relief, but it didn't last more than a moment. He was already thinking about the ways it might be a trap. If the Rosie turned toward the ring too soon, it would draw focus to them. Even if the Rosie evaded the black kite, there might be another Laconian ship, risking itself by waiting inside the ring space, ready to intercept any ship fleeing the system. Why are they running? Teresa asked. They don't think they're going to get away. Do they? Because that would be stupid. They aren't trying to save the ship, Amos said. He had the same patient, almost philosophical tone as when he was walking her through how to do a good weld in microgravity or checking the seal on a pipe. It was the voice of a teacher walking his student through a lesson and how the world worked, whatever they had on that ship. That Laconia was going to get pissed about. They can't hide it, not in the system as thin as this one. And there's no way they're slipping off and swapping transponders. So their ship's fucked. The trade station's big enough. They can maybe get the crew off and sneak onto other ships. Or pretend they were on the station all along, running to where the hiding places are. Teresa said, and the more lead time they have, the better the chances they can find a good spot. Amos said, it could be us. Jim thought, if the black kite had decided that we looked a little sketchier than the perishable harvest, we would be sacrificing the Rosie and hoping we could get small enough to overlook. Only it wasn't true. There was no hiding place in Cronus, or anywhere small enough that Laconia wouldn't look there. Plain sight was their best hope. Because their plan B was violence, he didn't think he'd said anything aloud, or made any kind of noise that would show his distress. But maybe he had, because Teresa looked at him with something between annoyance and sympathy. You know, I won't let them hurt you. I know that you'll try, Jim said. I'm still the daughter of the High Consul. She said I've gotten you out of trouble before. I'm not leaning on that trick. Jim said more harshly than he intended. Muskrat shifted, hold herself up to standing, and looked from Jim to Teresa and back in distress. Today says eyes hardened. I think what the captain's saying, Amos said, is that using you as a meat shield isn't something he's 100% comfortable with. It's not that you wouldn't do it, since you already did. But the people on the other end of that gun, we don't know them. They may not be the most reliable. And the less we have to count on them, the better. Teresa scowled, but less. Yes, Jim said. That was much more eloquent. Sometimes I'm good that way, Amos said. And it might have been a joke, or it might not. You want us to get this ship ready to rabbit. We've got enough reaction mass for a decent burn. I thought we needed fuel pellets. We do, but we can spend them getting out of Kronos. Put water on the grocery list and call it good. Recyclers are really going to be our limiting factor. The pull of the thought was stronger than gravity, like the drive. Put nose toward the ring gate and get the hell out before the enemy could get hold of them. Jim intentionally loosened his grip on the bulbs. "Naomi, what do you think?" An instant of silence then. "Sorry, I wasn't listening. What was the question? Should we prep the Rosie for a mad dash out of here?" As soon as the black kite's fully committed to its burn, we could make a break, no, she said. The way he had known she would, they haven't identified us. If we go too soon, it'll only make them suspicious. Better if we look like bystanders. Alex, plot and intercept with the White Oak. It's the big ice hauler at the second gas giant. Got her, Alex said. Amos shifted on his bench. Captain, I'm fine. If we need to run, Naomi said. We'll run. We'll always need to run. We'll never get to rest, Jim thought. There didn't seem like any point in saying it. Chapter to Tanaka. Eliana pressed the button on her vaporizer and inhaled deeply. The mist tasted like vanilla and hit her lungs like a soft, warm cloud. Nicotine and tetrahydrocannabinol mixed with just a touch of something more exotic. Something that tempered the THC sleepiness with a vivid hyper-awareness. The shades in her room were drawn, but the hint of light at the edges shifted the dust into a rainbow of sparks. She moved one leg, and the silk sheet caressed it. Like 1,000 tiny lovers, Tristan was asleep next to her, his small muscular butt pressed up against her thigh. He snored gently as he slept, punctuated by the occasional twitch and sigh. Eliana knew that she found the noise charming and sweet, because she was high in postcoital. The minute his snoring became annoying, Tristan would have overstayed his welcome. There were, in her experience, 2 ways to thrive in a rigid authoritarian regime. Initially the one most people reached for was to be what power wanted you to be. Mars had wanted loyal soldiers, and they had produced them. Like they were printing machine parts, she knew, because she was old enough that she'd been one of them. She'd seen her cohort try to strangle or excise from the collective souls anything that wasn't sufficiently Martian, and sometimes they'd managed. The other mode of survival was to enjoy having secrets, enjoy the power of seeming to be one thing while being another, and then be good at it. Even when it didn't involve fucking her junior officers, it was a kind of sexual perversion. The thrill of knowing that a wrong word or an unexpected slip could put a bullet in the back of her head was more crucial to her than the actual sex. A permissive open society where she could have done all the same things without fear of consequences would have driven her crazy. She'd loved being part of the Laconian experiment from the beginning, because Duarte's vision, initially as a capital offense against Mars and then as a permanent engine of danger, fed her kinks. She felt no shame about that. She knew what she was. Wake up, she said, pushing her fingers into the young man's back. Sleeping Tristan slurred at her. I know now, wake up. She jabbed him again. She spent 10 hours a week boxing and wrestling. When she stiffened her fingers, they were like iron bars. God damn it, Tristan said, then rolled over. He gave her a sleepy grin. His tousled blonde hair and clean-shaven face, with its deep dimples, made him look like a cherub in a classical painting. One of Raphael's putti. Eliana took another hit off the vaporizer and offered it to him. He shook his head. Why'd you wake me? Eliana stretched luxuriously under the soft sheets, her long frame barely contained by the oversized bed. I'm high, I wanna fuck. Tristan flopped onto his back with an exaggerated sigh. Ollie, I barely have any fluid left in my body. Then go get a glass of water, take a salt pill, and get your ass back into my bed. Aye, aye, Colonel Tristan said, laughing. The laugh ended in a sharp when she rolled over on top of him and slammed down onto his belly, locking his thighs to the bed with her ankles and feet, and gripping his wrists in her hands. He looked up at her with surprise, then, thinking it was sex play, started to struggle. His arms and chest were well formed but soft, more like a healthy teenager's. Then an individual in his 20s. Her arms were thin and ropey. The muscles of a long-distance runner, burned down to their essence through constant hard use. And strong as steel springs, when he tried to move she easily shoved him back down, squeezing her hands until his wrists popped, and he squealed, "Aliur." He started but she squeezed again and he shut up. She was angry and he saw it. She liked that she was angry. She liked that he saw it. "In this room, I am Aliana, you are Tristan," she said, speaking slowly, making sure the drugs weren't slurring her words. "Beyond that door, you are Corporal Reeves and I am Colonel Tanaka. Those things can never be confused for us. I know Kristen said I was just kidding. No kidding, no jokes, no slip you PS. If you make a mistake, if you forget the strict discipline that allows this to exist, I will at minimum be dishonorably discharged. I'd never." "And you," Aliana continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Well, not like the version of me that comes calling on you then." She stared down at him for a moment, waiting until his sudden fear turned into understanding. Then she let go of his wrists and climbed off of him. Lying back down on her side of the bed, "Get me some water too, would you?" she said. Tristan didn't answer, just got up and left the room. Aliana watched him go, enjoying the clenching of his thighs and ass as he walked the gentle V of his back and shoulders. He was very, very pretty when the thing they had inevitably ended. She was going to miss him, but that didn't change the fact that it would end. They always had before. That was part of the joy. A few moments later, Tristan returned carrying 2 glasses of water. He paused at the foot of the bed, looking unsure. Aliana patted the sheets next to her. "I'm sorry if I hurt you," she said. "It's okay," he replied, then handed her a glass and sat down next to her. "I'm sorry I slipped up, still wanna fuck in a minute," she said. They both gulped water for a while. "Will I see you again?" he eventually asked. Aliana found herself gratified by the hopefulness in his voice. "I should be on Laconia for a while this time," she replied, "and I do want to see you again. We just have to be careful." "I understand," he said, and she knew he did. She liked her toys to be much younger and much lower rank. It kept things simpler that way. But she didn't waste her time with stupid men, her thirst gone. The warmth in her lungs was spreading down to her belly in a very pleasant way. She reached over and put her hand on Tristan's thigh. "I think we should," the hand held on a nightstand chimed. She'd set it to do not disturb, which meant the device thought the incoming call was important. Enough to ignore that. She had had it a long time and trained it well. So it was probably right. She lifted it to check the connection request. It was coming from the state building. She accepted the connection without visual. "Colonel Tanaka here." Tristan slid out of bed and reached for his pants. "Good afternoon, Colonel. This is Lieutenant Sanchez with scheduling and logistics. You have a briefing at the state building in 2 hours. Initially, I've heard of it," she said, reaching for the side table and her sobriety meds. "Can you tell me the agenda?" "I'm sorry, Colonel. I don't have access to that. You are added to the attendees by Admiral Milan. The party was over." When she reached the state building, a light rain was falling. Tiny droplets turned the paving dark and shiny at the same time. The low mountain at the edge of the grounds looked like something from an ancient ukiyo, a print Yoshitoshi or Hiroshige, and at Ashe from the Science Directorate was waiting to meet her. With a cup of coffee and an umbrella, she waved both away. Tanaka knew her way around the state building. Most of her assignments were in the field, but she'd made enough friends and professional connections in the highest ranks of power that when she was on Laconia, she was often here. She hadn't been back since the siege of Laconia, the destruction of the construction platform, and the maybe kidnapping, maybe auto-emancipation of Teresa Duante. There weren't any physical changes to the building. The poured concrete was as solid as ever, the cut flowers in the vases as fresh. The guards in their razor-pressed uniforms were as stalled and calm, and everything felt fragile. The attaché guided her to an office she'd been in before. Yellow walls of domestic wood, with the blue seal of Laconia worked into them, and to austere sofas. Admiral Milan, acting commander-in-chief for the High Consoles, in seclusion, and Admiral Trejo was in Sol System. Sat at a wide desk, he was a broad individual with a heavy face, and salt and pepper hair shaved tight, and a crusty old sailor from the Mars days. Impatient with bullshit and quick-tempered as a badger, Tanaka liked him immensely. At one sofa, a lieutenant, with a signal intelligence insignia on the standard Laconian blue naval uniform, stood beside him. Dr. Okita of the Science Directorate sat with his hands on his knee, fingers laced together. The silence had the awkwardness of an interruption. Admiral Milan was the initially to speak. "We're running a little long here, Colonel." "Have a seat, we'll be done soon." "Yes, sir," Tanaka said, and took the others so far for herself. Admiral Milan looked to the standing Lieutenant Russef, to judge by his name tag, and drew a circle in the air with his fingertip. "Get on with it." Gadara system population just shy of 200,000. High concentration of fissionables in the upper crust. So they've been trying to get deep crust mining operations going for the last several years. Agriculture exists, but it's a decade away from self-sustaining. And the incursion, Admiral Milan said, 23 minutes 11 seconds. Russef answered, "Total loss of consciousness. Some accidental fatalities, some damage to the infrastructure. Mostly people crashing vehicles or falling off of things. And logs show that just seconds before the incursion, to unscheduled. Heavy freighters passed through the ring and went, Dutchman." Dr. Okita cleared his throat. There was something strange this time. Something stranger than everyone's brain shutting off. For 20 minutes, Admiral Milan said. "Yes," Admiral Okita answered. "A review of instrumentation during the event shows a different kind of time loss, as well." "Explain a short version," Okita said. "Lights went faster." Admiral Milan scratched his neck. "Did the word explain change meanings, and no one informed me?" Tanaka suppressed a smile. "Simply put, the speed of light is a function of basic properties of the universe. Call it the fastest casualty can propagate in vacuum." Ochita said. For 20-some minutes in the Gadara system, the nature of space-time shifted in a way that altered. The speed of light made it faster. The light delay from the ships at the Gadara ring to the planet at the time was slightly less than 40 minutes. Logs of the event show that during the incursion, it decreased by nearly 4,000 nanoseconds. 4,000 nanoseconds, Milan said. The nature of space-time changed in that system. For 20 minutes, Okita intoned, then waited for a reaction. He wasn't getting. He looked crestfallen. "Well," Milan said, "I will certainly have to think about this. Thank you for the briefing." "Lieutenant Doctor, you're both dismissed." "You stay, Colonel." "Yes, sir," Tanaka replied. Once the room was empty, Milan leaned back. "Drink, I've got water, coffee, bourbon, and some herbal tea." "Shit, my husband's both drink taste like grass clippings. Am I on active duty?" "I don't think. You need to concern yourself with breaking protocol, if that's what you mean." "Then bourbon sounds great, sir," Tanaka replied. Admiral Milan spent a minute fussing at his desk, then came back with a cut crystal glass and 2 fingers of smoky brown liquid swirling in it. "To your health," Tanaka said, then took a sip. "So," Milan said, and sat with the unconscious grunt of an old man with a lot of bad joints. "What do you think that light speed shit means?" "Not a clue, sir. I'm a shooter, not an egghead. This is why I've always liked you," he said, then sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The silence was different this time, and she wasn't certain what it meant. "So just between the two of us," one old sailor to another, "is there anything you want to tell me?" She felt the adrenaline hit her bloodstream. She didn't let it show. She was to practice that deception for that. I don't know what you mean. He tilted his head inside. I don't either. I find this whole thing pretty fucking mysterious. And I'm not as good at swallowing my curiosity as I was when we were young. Still genuinely unclear what we're talking about. Was someone supposed to tell me why you wanted me here? It wasn't me that wanted you. Drayo made the request, and he had me do a little paperwork on your behalf. He pulled out a physical folder of red paper with a silver string to close it, and handed it to her. It seemed so out of place. It was like being handed a stone tablet. She drank the rest of her bourbon off in one shot. Before she took it, it was lighter than she expected, and the string came undone easily. Inside was a single sheet of 3-layer surveillance parchment. The document verification circuits crisp as lace. Her picture was on it and her biometric profile. Her name and rank and identification record numbers, and a short passage granting her Omega status from the Laconian Intelligence Directorate. At the personal request of the High Council's office, if it had been a severed head, she wouldn't have been more surprised. Is this she began? Not a joke. Admiral Trejo was instructed that you be given the keys to the kingdom, override authority on any mission, access to any information, regardless of surveillance classification, immunity from censure, or prosecution for the duration of your deployment. Pretty sweet. You're really telling me you don't know what it's about? I assume there's a mission probably, but I'm not clear to know what it is. You just keep your seat. I can show myself out. When Admiral Milan closed the door behind him, the office system threw a comm message on the wall screen. After an instant, Admiral Trejo appeared. She'd known him for as long as she'd known anyone living. His eyes were still the same uncanny green, but now there were dark bags under them. His hair was thinning, and his skin had an unhealthy waxy shine. He looked haunted. Cardinal Tanaka, he said, I'm reaching out to you with a critical mission for the Empire. At present, I am taking a break from a hard burn from Sol System, and if this could wait until I arrived on Laconia, I'd brief you in person. It can't, so this will have to do. She stared into a bourbon glass. It was empty, and the bottle sat just a meter away. But suddenly she didn't want it anymore. She felt her focus sharpening. I'm sure that you, like everyone else in the Empire, are wondering what exactly the High Council has been doing in seclusion, how he has been spearheading the fight against the units that are threatening us from within the gates. I know there's been some speculation that he was somehow injured or incapacitated. So candidly, I need you to know that when I left for Sol System, the High Council was a drooling, brain-damaged moron who couldn't feed himself or wipe his own ass. He has been that way since the attack that destroyed the Typhoon and Medina Station. Tanaka took a deep breath and let it out through her teeth. Dr. Kurtusa had altered the High Council's biology considerably by using modified proto-molecule technologies. It left the High Council in possession of certain abilities that were not fully documented or explored before Dr. Kurtas's death. And in fact, Duarte killed him, waved his hand, and splattered that crazy fucker across half a room. I've never seen anything like it. Right now, the only people who know this are you, me, Dr. Okoye of the Science Directorate, and Teresa Duarte, who ran away with the Underground's assault forces after they cleaned our clock. So pretty much the whole fucking enemy. Given that for background, you'll understand how confused I was when the High Council appeared to me 80.85 hours ago in my office in Sol System. He didn't register on the sensors. He didn't interact with any physical object or leave any evidence of his presence that could be verified by an beyond observer, but he was here. And before you get too happy with the Anton Trejos having a psychotic break theory, there's some external evidence, just not here in Seoul. Shortly after I experienced what I experienced, Duarte disappeared from the state building, not popped out of reality. Disappeared. He put on his pants and a fresh shirt, had a cup of tea and a polite conversation with his valet, then walked off the grounds. Every planetary sensor we have has been sweeping the landscape. Since then, no one has seen him. We've got over 1,000 colony systems that are wondering if there's anything left of the government. We have extra-dimensional enemies experimenting to find ways to snuff us out wholesale, and I'm convinced that the answer to both of those issues is Winston Duarte, or whatever the fuck he's turned into. I've known you for a long time, and I trust you. Your mission is to find him and bring him back. You've heard of carte blanche, but I promise you have never seen a check this blank. I don't care what you spend, not in money, equipment, or lives, as long as you bring Winston Duarte back from wherever he's gone. If he doesn't want to come, convince him nicely if you can, but this only ends with him in our custody. Good hunting, Colonel. The message ended. Tanaka leaned back on the sofa, stretching her arms to her sides like a bird unfurling its wings. Her mind was already ticking away, the strangeness of it, the shocking revelations, the threats it posed. All of those were in her. She could feel them. But there was also the calm of a job that needed doing, and the pleasure deeper than she would have guessed at the power she had just been given. The door opened quietly and Admiral Milan came. Back in everything all right? He asked. Tanaka laughed. Not even close. Chapter 3. Naomi. They waited until the black kite was far enough from the ring gate that an intercept burn would have been difficult, if not impossible. Then they waited a little more so that they wouldn't seem suspicious for starting their transit burn at the initially possible moment. And then Naomi couldn't stand waiting anymore. 3 hours after that, the Laconian frigate hit them with a tight beam, demanding in official language and harsh tones of voice who they were and where they thought they were going. This is the Vincent Sue Independent Trader, on contract with Atmosphere Shared Liability Corporation, out of Earth. We are carrying all samples for quality control testing. Our public contracts and permissions are attached. Message repeats. The voice was built from samples of 10 different men, slip mixed by the Rosie system, so that, even if the Laconians realized the message was false, they wouldn't be able to track the voice patterns back to anyone. The Vincent Sue was a real ship with a similar drive, signature, and silhouette to their present, modified version of the Rosie, though it didn't work beyond Sol system. The contracts the message included would come back as real. Unless someone started digging into them, it was as plausible a mask as Naomi could fashion. They aren't responding. Alex said. They were both on the ops deck. The lighting was low though. She noticed that Alex had started keeping even the low settings a little higher than he had when they both had younger eyes. Could be good, could be bad, Naomi said. Sure wish I could tell which it was. If they start chasing us with their guns blazing, then it was bad. Alex nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. I just wish they'd say, hey, we decided not to chase you down and kill you, just out of courtesy. At this range, we'll have plenty of time to watch violent death barrel down on us. You won't miss anything. Well, thank God for that. With every minute the black kite didn't answer and didn't turn its drives in pursuit, Naomi felt the fear of capture or destruction fade and the fear of transit grow. It was hard to believe that there had been a time when her life hadn't been moving from one trauma to the next, like walking on stepping stones in an ornamental garden. There had been whole decades when passing through the ring gates hadn't been more than a passing unease. Yes, if there was too much traffic, the ship could go Dutchman, quietly vanish from existence for who knew where or no place. But it had been the same scale of threat as anything. They could hit a micrometeor that broke their drive. The magnetic bottle could fail and spill. The free fusion reaction into the body of the ship, she could have a stroke once. There have been rules about how the gates worked. Human rules about what traffic was allowed through. Inhuman rules about how much matter and energy could pass through in a certain period of time. Without angering the dark ship-eating gods, all of that was gone now. How many ships you think they have looking for us? Alex asked, you mean how many ships do they own? Or how many are in the specific hunt group? Tasked with trying to find us, Alex was silent, then made a soft clicking sound with his tongue. Probably wouldn't like either answer. Would I? How long until we reach the gate? If we don't break before the transit, about 18 hours. Naomi unstrapped from her crash couch and stood up. The deck rose up under her thrust gravity. At just over half a G, I'm going to get some rest. Call me if someone decides to kill us. Will do, Alex said. Is she headed for the lift? And then, how's Jim? Naomi looked back. Alex's face was tinted blue by the light of his screen. The thin white stubble of hair clinging to the side and back of his head reminded her of pictures of snow on rich soil, and the gentleness in his eyes informed her. The question hadn't really been a question. Yeah, I know, she said, but what can I do? She made her way down to the crew decks, listening to the reassuring hum of the ship around her. After so many years in close company with the Rosie, she could judge the health of the ship by its sounds, even if she hadn't known already that they were running the drive just a little out of balance. She'd have been able to pick up on it from the way the decks muttered and creaked. When Jim had been taken prisoner by Laconia, Naomi had mourned him, mourned the version of herself that had him at her side. When against all odds he'd come back, she hadn't really been ready. It was something she hadn't let herself hope for, and so she hadn't thought deeply about how it would be. The crash couch was rigged up for the two of them to share. For extended hard burns, one or the other of them might take one of the spare cabins, or more often a couch on the ops deck. The doubled couch wasn't built for optimum function. So much as quality of life, the pleasure of waking up at someone's side, the intimacy of watching them sleep, feeling them breathe, knowing on a cellular level that she wasn't alone. Jim was sleeping when she came into the room. He still looked thinner than she remembered him being. Before his time in prison, before her time and self-exile. It might only have been the graying of his hair, but the skin of his eyelids seemed darker than it had been before, as though he'd been bruised in a way that wouldn't heal. Even in sleep there was a rigidity to his body, like he was braced against an attack. She informed herself that he was recovering, and that was probably true. She could feel the passing days and weeks changing her, too, letting her expand a little bit more into a place she hadn't had access to. When they had all been apart, it was different than it had been. Bobby was gone, Clarissa was gone. Amos was transformed in ways that made her skin crawl, if she let herself think about it too much. And Teresa and her dog were there, half permanent passengers and half threat. Even so, this was closer to the life she'd had than she had any right to expect. A version of her family back together. Sometimes that was a comfort. Sometimes it was just a way to be nostalgic for what hadn't returned. If they could stop, recover, decompress, who knows what else they might have been able to salvage. But they couldn't. She laid down beside him, her head pillowed on one folded arm. Jim shifted, yawned, cracked open one eye. His smile was the same boyish bright. Delighted to see her. This time is a gift, she thought. And she smiled back. Hey, sexy lady, Jim said, "What did I miss?" Years she thought we missed years. Instead of the truth, she smiled. "Nothing critical," she said. "I really want to slow us down," Alex said. Naomi and the galley was putting the remains of her meal into the recycler. They had cut thrust and the horror of the vacuum. Sucking the stray bits of food into the system was almost as loud as Alex's voice over the comms. On the wall screen, the Cronus ring gate, tongue against a wide field of stars. The weird dark twisting mass at its perimeter, visible only because of the rose's enhancements. With each passing second, the magnification dropped. The ring was 1,000 clicks across. Their transit was counting down from 12 minutes. And it still would have been invisible to the naked eye. "You can tap the brakes if you want to," Naomi said. "But if there's unfriendly company in the ring space, it'll just make us easier to hit. I want to charge up the rail gun." Alex said, "But you won't let me, so I'm sublimating. You could recheck the torpedoes and PTCs. Anderson Teresa are doing that already. I don't want to seem like I don't trust them. You could arm the whole charges. And be ready to blow the disguise plates off." Alex was silent for a long, slow breath across the little room. Jim gave her an approving thumbs up. "Yeah, I'll do that," Alex said. "Really want my rail gun up though, when we're on the other side. You can charge it to your heart's content." Naomi said, "Promises, promises." A click said that Alex had dropped the connection. The magnification on the ring gate continued its slow fall. Naomi called up a little inset window pointing back. The noise from their drive cone made the image blurry, grainy, and approximate, but even so, she could see that the black kite wasn't moving toward them. "I'm not seeing a repeater." Jim said. "They blew ours up, but it doesn't look like they dropped one. I noticed that. They aren't worried about coordinating with anyone on the other side, so there's at least a chance. We aren't burning straight into a trap. Yay." 10 minutes remained. "Ready?" Naomi asked an answer. Jim pulled himself to a wall handhold and pushed off toward the central lift. Naomi opened a connection to Amos. "We're taking stations on the ops deck. Not that we're expecting any trouble, but if there is some, I hear you, boss. I've already got the pup in her kennel, in case we bang around a little." Bang around a little meaning evade incoming fire. "And Teresa," there was one of his odd pauses before he answered. "We're strapping down in engineering. You have a need, just say the word." Naomi dropped the connection and followed Jim. The lift was at the bottom of the shaft, locked down until someone called it, and they swam through the empty air of its shaft. Until they reached ops, they went to their usual stations, pulled the straps across their bodies, shifted the screens to the controls. They would each take if the transit landed them in danger. The combination of fear and familiarity turned it into a ritual, like brushing your teeth before sleep. The ring persisted, but the lensing of the telescopy put fewer stars around it. "Now ready," and ops Naomi said. "Flat deck." Alex said. "Yeah." Amy said, "We're good." "Do you think the counter reached 0? Jim took a short breath. The gate blinked to the grainy trailing image. The same structure, but behind them now and receding. The stars all went out at once, and we are through, Alex said. "No threats on the board so far as I can see. But shit howdy, are there too many people in here? I'm flipping us around and putting the brakes on, until we know where we're headed." The thrust gravity warning went on, even though he just said it. And after an instant of indigenous rotation up and down, returned. The gel of the couch pressed into Naomi's back. She had already brought up the tactical map. The ring space, what she still thought of as the slow zone, even though there hadn't been the hard limit on velocity here. Since Jim, and a proto-molecular echo of Detective Miller, had turned it off decades ago, was a little smaller than the sun and Sol system. 1,000,000 Earths could fit in it, but the only things it contained now were 1,371 ring gates, the single enigmatic station at its center, and 52 ships, including the Rosie, all of them on transits of their own. Alex was right, it was too many, it was dangerous. How many do you think we've lost? Jim asked when she looked over. He had the same screen open before him. Just underground ships, no, I mean the big we. Everyone Laconian underground, civilians, just trying to get supplies where they're needed. How many do you think we've lost? No way to know, she said. No one's keeping track anymore. There's a war on. She set the Rosie to identify the ships by transponder, drive signature, thermal profile, and silhouette, to note any discrepancies and flag any ships that were known to be associated with the underground or the Laconian Empire. It took the ship system 3 seconds to produce a compiled list with cross notations and a navigable interface. Naomi started the human work of paging through. The ships most closely allied with Laconia were a freighter called 8 Tenants of Bushido that operated out of Baragon, and a long-range explorer called the Flying Buffalo that was based in Seoul but owned by a corporate network that had embraced Duarte's rule. The instant Earth and Mars had surrendered, neither were warships. And both Scrut Naomi is being allies of convenience, more than true believers in the Laconian cause. They weren't part of the official Laconian hierarchy. Anyway, the only ship on her known underground contacts was an independent rock hopper out of Seoul that was flying as the Caustic Bitch, but was listed in the registry as Pinkwink. There was probably a story there, but Naomi wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. There was also a bottle on the float. One of yours, Jim asked. Hope so, Naomi said, we'll see. Once, humanity's comm network had been a fairly robust thing. In-system radio signals hit repeaters at the ring gates that were either strong enough to shout over the interference in the gates or actually physically penetrated them. With transceivers on both sides, Medina Station at the heart of the ring space had maintained the man to monitor the comm traffic. For decades, a message from Earth could reach Baragon and receive an answer back within a day, even if the signal queuing was swamped. But with the death of Medina and the rise of the underground that was gone, now the 13 worlds communicated in a shifting patchwork of relays, ships carrying messages, and the modified torpedoes she called bottles. This one in particular was an advanced design, set to wait and gather incoming messages from the underground that were meant for her and keep them until it was triggered. It was an imperfect system, and she was certain she'd lost more than a few along the way, but it was easy to verify, difficult to fake, and difficult, if not impossible, to trace. She pulled up the Epstein drive controls and dropped in a slightly altered feed pattern. To anyone besides the bottle, it would be unremarkable, well within the range of normal drive fluctuations. To the sensor array on the surface of the bottle, it would match a pattern. It did. The bottle shouted a dense blip of tightly packed data, putting it out, broadcast for any ship in the slow zone to hear. A tight beam would have pointed a finger. If anyone had caught back scatter from it, this could be meant through any of the dozens of ships that could hear it, and every now and then the underground set false bottles to sneak into the slow zone or a gate, to spit out fake data and confuse the patterns. The Rosie's system sucked in the radio burst and set quietly to work decrypting it, while at the edge of the ring space, the bottle lit its own drive and zipped out through one of the gates. Naomi's underground knew to watch for its detonation as the sign to place another one when they could, if the Laconians saw it, even if they knew what it meant. There still wasn't anything for them to do about it. It was all run like an Opus L, read large, and Naomi was the one who designed it. The sins of her past finding a use, well, that could have gone a lot worse. Jim said, I guess the question now is where we go next. That will depend on what's in the data. Naomi said, I don't like spending more time in the ring space than we have to. I would also hate to be eaten by units from beyond space and time. Before it was my turn, the lightness and humor. She'd always known were still there. But there was an emptiness behind it, not nihilism, she thought, exhaustion. If we need to, she began. There's always, Teresa's voice cut in on the shipwood echoes. I need help in the machine shop. I need help now. A Jim was unstrapped. Before the girl had finished speaking, all the weariness was gone from him. He didn't wait for the lift to engage. Dropping down the handholds in the shaft, like climbing down a ladder, Naomi was barely behind him. Some part of her was almost relieved to see him moving. With certainty again, like catching a glimpse of the Jim from before. Even if a lot of him was in hiding, he was still in there. What's going on? Alex asked from the flight deck. Something's happening to Amos, Teresa said. She had the tense calm of an emergency responder. We're on our way, Naomi said. Jim didn't respond at all. When I reached the engineering deck, Naomi heard something, a voice. Amos's voice, but not with words in it. It was a low, wet sound, half growl, half gargle. Something about it reminded her of drowning. She and Jim strode down to the machine shop together. Teresa was positioned on the deck, her legs crossed and cradling Amos's wide, bald head and her lap as he jerked and shuddered. A pale foam dripped from his mouth, and the pure black eyes were wide and empty. A sickening smell, as much metallic as organic, filled the air. He's having a seizure, Jim said. Teresa's voice trembled when she spoke. Why? Why is this happening? Chapter 4. Elvie, get her out, Elvie said. I'm pulling the plug, no, Kara replied. The girl's voice was still shaking, but the words were clear. I can do this. Kara's brain function showed in several different datasets. On twice that many screens, the data from the BFE, the technician's pet name, for the Jupiter-sized block of green crystal. That was the only feature of a DRO system showed. Beside it, advanced pattern matching protocols mapped the two together in 6 dimensions. The instability had passed in both datasets, the seizure, if that's what it was. Falling back from turbulence to a more stable flow all around the lab. The researchers and techs turned wide and uncertain eyes toward Elvie. She could feel the desire to keep pushing forward. From her whole staff, she felt it herself. It reminded her of being the Ra in her graduate dorm house and having to shut down the whole parties. I am the lead researcher, she is the test subject. When I say we're pulling the plug, we're pulling the plug. As her team sprang to life, closing down the experiment, she turned to Kara, who was floating over the bed of imaging sensors. Sorry, it's not that I don't trust you, it's that I don't trust any of this. The girl with the pure black eyes nodded, but her focus was on something else. As visual and audio critices were lit up, like Paris at New Year's, and a deep, slow pulse was passing through the girl's post-central gyrus that matched the energy readings coming from the BFE's southern hemisphere. Whatever Kara was feeling just then, it was taking up more of her focus than Elvie was. She had the sense that she could scream in Kara's ear right now and still be a tiny minority of the information flooding the girl's brain, or for that matter the girl's body, which was part of the issue. Elvie had studied somatic recognition theory, but the degree to which the BFE seemed to want to present its information to Kara's whole nervous system, muscles and viscera included, was complicating things. She's pulled back through the data as her team ran the shutdown procedures and brought Kara back to merely human reality. The Falcon Elvis, personal and state-sponsored science ship, was the most advanced, single-function laboratory in 13 worlds, which sounded really impressive. Until she remembered that most of those 13 worlds were the equivalent of 1880s European dirt farmers trying to grow enough food to not slaughter half their cattle at the start of every winter. The Falcon was the only ship that had survived the attack. That killed the Typhoon and Medina Station, and the scars showed everywhere. The decking was subtly mismatched, where threads of darkness that had been somehow more real than reality had ripped a third of the ship's mass away. The power and environmental systems were all patchworks of the original, and rebuilt. Her own leg had a line across it, where the new skin and muscle had grown in the soft, ball-sized scoop that had vanished in the attack. Working on the Falcon was like living inside a trauma flashback. It helped Elvie when she could focus on the data and on the BFE and on Kara and Zan. Dr. Hashan Lee Elvis' second lead met her eye and nodded. He was an energetic young scientist, and she liked him. More than that, she trusted him. He knew what she wanted to do, and with a gesture he'd offered to make sure Kara's reemergence from the experiment went according to protocol. She nodded back, accepting the offer. "All right, people," Lee said, clapping his hands together. "By the numbers and by the book." Elvie pulled herself through the air to the lift shaft and aft toward the engine and the isolation chamber. And Kara's younger brother Zan, fires floated against one wall, his left leg tucked behind a wall grip and his hand terminal glowing with text. Beside him, the thing they called the catalyst, the body of a woman infused with a contained but live sample of proto-molecule, was strapped in its gurney. The catalyst's sightless eyes found her, and Fires followed its empty gaze. "How'd he do?" Elvie asked, nodding toward the containment chamber. And therefore Zan. Most of the time the catalyst was stored there, but for the periods when they used it to activate the old alien technology, she put Zan in its place. The only time the young boy in the proto-molecule interacted at all was during the changeover. Fees pulled up a screen with the surveillance camera inside the isolation chamber. Zan floated. His eyes were closed, and his mouth was just slightly open, like he was sleeping or drowned. Listened to some music, read a few issues of Naka and Corvallis, and went to sleep, Fia said, for all the world like the pre-adolescent boy he appears to be. Elvie pulled herself to a stop at her husband's side. The data on his hand terminal was the feed from the lab, laid side by side with the monitors trained on Zan. She could tell at a glance that there wasn't a correlation between them. Whatever Kara was going through, Zan wasn't being subjected to it along with her, or at least not obviously. She'd still feed everything through pattern matching. She wasn't conscious of sighing, but Fires touched her arm as if she had. "You heard about Guitar System?" She nodded. "Light speed change. Dark gods banging around in the attic." "Feels like that's happening more often. We'll need more data points for a good frequency analysis," he said. "But yeah, it does. I hate the feeling that something vast and angry is scratching at the corners of reality and looking for a way to kill me. It's only scary because it's true." He ran a hand through his hair. He'd gone silver, and when they were on the float, he tended to look like something out of a children's cartoon. Elva's hair was well on its way to white, but she kept it short, mostly because she hated the compression fluid in the high-G crash couches, and it took forever to get the smell of it out. Of longer hair, you shut down early. There was some instability. When she cinched up with the BFE, now it was Fires' turn to sigh. "I wish they didn't call it that. It's a diamond, not an emerald. I know, sorry. And anyway, BFD's funnier," he said. But there wasn't any heat to it. Their marriage was a vast tissue of in-jokes. Light comic bits, shared curiosity, and common trauma. They built it like a code between them. Over the course of decades, she knew the inflections. That meant he had something that was interesting him. And how it sounded, different from when he was angry about something, when he was trying to protect her, and when he was struggling with something. He was seeing but couldn't understand. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "You didn't notice the sync." "What sync?" Fires pulled up the data set again. On one side, the brain and body of a teenage girl, fixed at the age when she died, and been repaired by alien technology. On the other, the particle, scatter, and magnetic resonances of a vast crystal that, if they were lucky, held the history of a galaxy-spanning species, whose tracks they were following toward extinction. She could trace the similarities with her fingers. Fires lifted his eyebrows, waiting for her to notice something. She shook her head. He pointed to a tiny indicator. On the side of the readout, in frame light delay correction offset 0.985s, she frowned. "We're 0.985 light seconds from the diamond." Fire said, "Matching orbit around the star, neither moving toward nor away from it. The last time we tried this." Kara and the diamond were talking back and forth, call and response. Now they're singing in harmony, no like delay. Elvie felt the implications running through her mind. Like water spilling down a creek, they'd always known that the proto-molecule was able to do strange things with locality, but they thought it was related to quantum entanglement of particles. Kara and the BFE hadn't exchanged any particles that she knew of, so this pseudo-instantaneous information transfer was something new, one of the fundamental hypotheses of proto-molecule technology had just taken a profound hit. It also meant that their reaching out to the artifact had gotten it to reach back. Her experiment was working. She'd expected success to feel less like fear. When Elvie had started working for the Laconian Empire, it had been under duress. Winston Duarte had taken over all humanity with the speed and thoroughness of a plague. When he'd invited her to a senior position in his science directorate, the answer was yes. It would have been a dream job, except for the consequences of refusing it. Then Duarte's plan to confront the units that killed off the civilizations that built the ring gates went wrong. Duarte was crippled by it, and Elvis' immediate boss, Paola Cortasa, was reduced to a thin stinking mist. Elvie, who wanted the job but not the employer, found herself receiving a field promotion to the head of the Laconian Science Directorate, with the understanding that her primary task was to figure out how to stop the attacks that were knocking out consciousness, sometimes in single systems, sometimes all through the Empire. Unless her primary task was to find a way to fix Duarte's scrambled mind, or maybe to prevent any more ships from vanishing in the transit between the normal universe and the weird nexus of the ring space. She had the nearly infinite resources of the Empire behind her, the survival of humanity on her shoulders, and a research protocol so streamlined it would have failed out of an ethics review board for just the table of contents. There were two levels that she had to figure out. First was the civilization that had built the proto-molecule, and the gates, then the units that destroyed them. On her best days, she thought of herself like a medieval monk, struggling to understand the saints, to better see the face of God. More often, she felt like a termite, trying to explain dogs to her fellow Isoptera, so that they could all speculate about fusion jazz. She understood the proto-molecule engineers and what had killed them better than anyone else in all of humanity. Except if this worked for Kara and Zan, it was like being in a dream. Kara said, "Only bigger. I don't remember really tasting things in dreams. You know, this was tasting things and hearing things. And the shape of my body seemed like it was changing. It was everything. I didn't feel anything," Zan said. He sounded disappointed. Originally, Elvie had done the debris things with the two siblings separately, talking initially to Kara and then to Zan, the idea being that by keeping them from hearing each other's accounts, she could keep them from influencing those reports, but it stressed both of them to be apart. Now she brought them into her personal lab together, the two of them on the float, while she braced herself at her desk and wrote up her notes. The decor was rich psychiatrist's office. Blonde grass-colored padding on the walls, spider plants and capillary-fed niches. The low posts of a dedicated air recycler. Everything about it was designed to say that the woman who used it was a very crucial person. She hated it more than a little, but she didn't spend the energy to examine. Why was it different from the last time? Elvie asked. There was a stutter. Like an instant when everything fell apart, and when it came back together. Everything was brighter and more immediate. It's not the right word. There may not be a right word. How did it compare to your experience of the library? Elvie asked. Kara went eerily still for a moment. The way she and Zan did sometimes. Elvie waited for a breath, and then Kara came back. The library isn't sensory at all. It's just knowing things, but this. It isn't the library, but it's where the information all comes from. I'm sure about that. Zen made a soft noise. Kara put a hand on his arm and pulled him close to her. A primate's instinct to comfort by cuddling. Unchanged by its translation, across light years of vacuum. Into a bubble of ceramic steel and carbon lace. Were you able to interact with it as all? I think so, Kara said. I mean, I didn't understand what I was doing. But I think I can figure it out. I feel fine. I'm ready to go back. In Elvie typed. Subject shows strong desire to return to interface. Consistent with drop in dopamine and serotonin levels. Post-experiment, addictive. That's good, she said out loud. There are a couple recalibrations we need to make, but we should be ready for another run in a couple shifts. And I'm going to want to run a scan or two. While we're doing that, check your baseline. Okay, Kara said, almost hiding her impatience. Whatever you want. Zan fidgeted against his sister's arm, setting both of them turning a little. I'm hungry. Go ahead, Elvis said. I need to write this up, but you should eat and rest. I'll be along in a little bit. Kara nodded once gathered Zen close to her. Thank you, doctor. She pushed off Elvie's workstation with one long graceful leg. The children or test subjects or human-alien hybrids, or however Elvie thought of them in the moment, closed the door behind them. Elvie pressed her palms against her eyes until colors bloomed and she let out her sigh. Her body was rattling with exhaustion and excitement and anxiety. It felt like drinking too much coffee, and she hadn't had any at all. She wrote down the rest of her observations of Kara and Zan and attached the raw data to the report. Then it was just her summary still to go. She shifted the interface to dictation and let herself float away from her desk. Her leg wanted her to stretch, but it also wanted to cramp. Ever since she'd regrown the hole in her thigh. It did this sometimes. We are seeing definite progress, she said. And the words laid themselves out on her screen. The tragic relationship between proto-molecule catalyst, conscious subject, and the BFE. Elvie scowled and made a clicking sound with her tongue. That backed out the last two words. The presumed alien data core seems to be finishing what we're calling its handshake protocol. I am concerned that the primary subject in the interface weren't designed for each other, and the interaction between them might be, she clicked twice again, has the potential to be destructive to one or both of them. Her office door opened and fires floated in. She raised a hand asking for silence as he stopped himself on a handhold. She waited for the door to close before she went on. The next phase will be trying to confirm information we already have. Specifically, I'm going to ask the subject a set of simple questions about details from the research into artifacts and archaeology from several systems that you wouldn't possibly have had access to if she can confirm information we already have. That will let us move forward with some confidence that what we get from her further on will be trustworthy but since she was present in Kurtaz's personal lab, and we don't know what his information hygiene was with the subjects, I'm having to be very careful in choosing test questions. Neither subject seems to have been affected by the events in Gadara system, the staff here, myself included. Haven't had any blackouts or losses of consciousness since the all systems attack months ago. Without knowing what constraints the enemy is working under, I can interpret the limited scope of the Gadara attack as an indication that it is still in an experimental phase, looking for interactions that will be effective in disabling us, or that the new attacks required more effort and the enemy doesn't want to expand them, or that we just don't have enough information yet to know what we're seeing. And I'm just talking out of my ass. She clicked her tongue to delete the sarcastic editorial at the end, and then finish the report. She started spooling through the text to look for errors and typos. Fires shifted over to her side, watching the screen over her shoulder. You didn't say, and if we don't get a handle on it soon, the bad guys will figure out how to snuff out all our minds like so many billions of candles. And the cockroaches will have to evolve enough to take over before we get an answer, and I think before the cockroaches. Elvis said predatory superorganisms. Cockroaches are just mobile food pods to them. You've given this a lot of thought. She routed copies of the report to Dr. Okita at the Science Directorate, back on Laconia, and privately to Admiral Anton Trejo, who was at the instant the closest thing Laconia had to a controlling intelligence for their own predatory superorganism. Somewhere on the Falcon, a tight beam stuttered on and off, spilling light to the repeaters. They dropped behind them, on the assumption that they were still up and functioning. At the speed of light, it would take the information almost an hour to reach the ring gate, then across the couple together. War-ravaged unreliable communications network that laced the ring space. And then she didn't know how long to reach Trejo. She packaged another copy of the report, flagged for easy interception by the underground, and addressed to Naomi Nagata. She sent it to. That's going to get us in trouble someday, Fire said. We're already in trouble. Yeah, but it's cosmic units beyond space and time. Kill us all trouble. Feeding all our data to the underground is ship. Surveillance shoots us for trees and trouble. Elvie laughed, but it was a tight, angry laugh. What we're doing here is bigger than politics, I know, he said. I just keep hoping the politicians see it too, as if in response. Her system chimed a high-priority message from Laconia. Elvis eyes only. That's fucking eerie, Fire said. You want privacy? No, she said, but I better take it anyway. The door closed behind him and she started the playback. Kelly Winston, Duarte's personal valet, leaned in toward the camera. His lips were thin and gray. Whatever it was, it looked like bad news. Dr. Okoye, I have been authorized by Admiral Trejo to brief you on a surveillance matter. That may touch on your work. There's been a change in High Conso Duarte's status. Chapter 5 Tanaka, the Laconian mechanized infantry suit. Special Reconnaissance, or more affectionately the Stalker, was a marvel of design, built for extended recon. It was lighter and faster than the standard suit, and instead of bristling with weaponry, it was covered with sensors and tracking systems. It wasn't meant for front-line fighting. Its job was to slip in, spot the enemy and mark the targets, then slip away before the heavily armored shock troops arrived to take care of business. The small-caliber rapid-fire Gatling gun on the suit's white arm meant a stalker could still handle a little business of its own should the need arise in her many decades of service. Initially in the Martian Marine Corps, a member of the elite force, Recon Battalion at Hecate Base, and later as a combat officer in the newly created Laconian Marines. Tanaka had worn just about every model of power armor made. The stalker suit was her favorite, long and lean, fast as a greyhound and tough as nails. She'd always fancied that the suit looked like a robotic version of herself. The one she wore now was currently a gentle, mottled green, the color shifting surface, changing to match the rolling forest and Laconian brush that the suit's 360 optics were picking up. It didn't make her invisible, but it meant the suit's camouflage was always appropriate for the environment. 2 large battery packs rode in the back, giving her a 90-hour range. The gun was loaded with a belt of mixed armor. Piercing and high explosive, she loped through the forest at an easily sustainable 20 kilometers an hour. Scattering the small animals before her, there was no reason to move cautiously. Unless she actually found the High Council, out here nothing in the wild was a threat to her. She'd started her work by reviewing some of the files and background previously closed to her, actual information about the High Council's personal life. And data was thin, even with Omega's status to unlock files for her. His medical records were sketchy and vague. Much of his privacy had been preserved over the years by never recording data in the initially place. Everyone else on Laconia, on the other hand, was well documented. She'd taken the High Console's laundry and locked it in a room with her suit sensor package. While she prepped for the trip, when she put the suit on it, identified the chemical markers of every human who'd come in contact with the fabric. All but one of them were identifiable. Process of elimination made the remaining signal. The High Council negative space for hunting animals. Now she had a scent. From the surveillance records, she could track Duarte to the edge of the state building's grounds. And then a little beyond it, the track after that was thin. Wind had scattered the scents, rain had washed them away. Laconia wasn't a huge planet, but it was still an entire planet. Duarte had left days before on foot. Best case scenario, he was still walking, and she'd be able to find him in a long afternoon. But the colony worlds had a habit of sprouting ancient transportation networks. Methods the aliens who'd engineered the place had used to move shit around if he'd happened into one of them. He could be anywhere on Laconia or miles under it. If she could find where he'd accessed it, she'd have the next step. That was all it took. One step after another until the mission was done. She was moving fast enough to surprise a family of bone elk digging for food in the soil with their impressive racks of horns. They startled at her sudden appearance, then all bolted in different directions. Trying to get away, her suit tracked them all, marking their threat level as low. If she overrode that and changed the threat to high, the gun on her arm would turn the entire herd into paste. And seconds, she chose not to, and initially she followed the vague signs. A 15% match, hardly better than an educated guess. LED down a particular animal trail, lined by silver-leaved bushes. A 20% match went directly up a sheer rock wall, and she discarded it as a false positive. As she crisscrossed the landscape, her mind relaxed into the experience of the search, and time became less concrete. She'd heard about a similar kind of flow with artists when they fell deeply into their work. It was a lovely way to be alone in her head, with the pure focus of the task. She made steady speed through the narrow band of forest and into the rocky foothills of a mountain. When she reached it, she had a pretty good hunch where she was going. Topographical maps led her through a twisty box canyon and up to the entrance of a cave. It was well hidden from casual view. No wonder no one had found it. Without a concerted effort, Teresa must have thought she'd found the best hiding spot in the world. A pair of large rodent-like creatures, black fur and eyes, calloused mouths and ears like seashells, were in the entrance, fighting or mating or some combination of the two. They stopped and hissed at her as she approached. Bearing brownish hook needle teeth, she kicked them out of the way. They hit the cave wall with a wet thud and stopped moving. She considered the little bodies for a moment and ducked into the darkness below the stone. The tunnels near the entrance were where the enemy spy had lived for years. His stink was still everywhere. The suits also found traces of Teresa and a dozen other Laconians. The extraction team that had killed Timothy, or Amos Burton or whoever he'd been, and then the search team that came, looking for his corpse and his equipment. The report said he'd been positioned on a backpack nuke the whole time. The prevailing theory was that he was waiting to see if he could extract James Holden before using it. She had a certain respect for that. There was a purity about someone who could casually hold death in his hands. Just waiting for the right moment, the suit thought it had Duarte's scent. But if the High Consul had come through here, his trail was either to faint or to muddle up with everyone else's. For the suit to track it with certainty, she moved through the cave, trying to recapture the pure state she'd felt in the forest. But something about killing the little knot rats and finding the evidence of the spy's nest had gotten her thinking the pure and beautiful instant was gone. Even if the hunt was still on, the stone here was pale, flaking, and weak. She could have dug a passage through it with the powered gloves of her suit. It made her more than a little worried about cave-ins, especially after she got past the entry area, where the camp had been, and the tunnel system turned into a maze. Her suit's inertial tracking meant it could create a 3D map of everywhere she went, in real time, but the mountain was large. If the tunnels carved their way through the whole thing, she could be there for days, if she was right and Duarte had come here. It was going to be hard getting him out. The efficient thing would have been to call for a swarm of micro-drones and flood the tunnels with them. But Trejo had impressed on her the need for strict operational security, and including attack team to run the drones felt like an unnecessary risk. Still, if she couldn't put her hands on the man, that could be her plan B. She wasn't ready to give up though, not yet. The farther into the cave she got, the less natural they seemed near the entrance. They had felt like accidents of geology, but here and there strange textures and protrusions began dotting the walls and grew up from the floors in the larger caverns, black and silver, spirals that seemed to carry their own light. Tanaka had spent enough time on Laconian warships, built by the strange orbital shipyards, to know proto-molecule builder tech. When she saw it, this place had definitely been one of their installations, but its purpose was lost to time. The report from the investigation team had marked the location as needing further study. But with the attack on Laconia, everyone seemed to have just forgotten about it. No one's initially priority unless maybe Duarte's. She passed through a complex junction, an east-west tunnel above, intersecting with a curving north to southeastern one below. And the suit alerted. She checked the display. 75% match in the upper passage. Got you, she said, only maybe she didn't. She followed the suit's prompting through the twists and turns of a section of tunnels, the chemical signal staying between 75 and 60% match, and came out into a large room filled with elaborate crystalline growths. They rose from the floor like delicate, 5-meter-high towers of glass lattice, glowing in soft pastel colors. When her suit's lights hit them, in another context, they'd have been breathtakingly lovely, a kind of post-revivification, abstract sculpture. She wondered if they were made by alien intelligences or the blind, idiot units of nature. That she couldn't tell was either beautiful or damning. But either way, beside the point, the suit was sure the High Consul had been in the room. Her initially 100% hit, whether he was still in there or not. Duarte had definitely stood where she was, or very close to it, had seen the crystals with his weirdly altered eyes. Her heart rate increased a little as the realization struck that she might actually be able to find him. The relief at a real prospect of success showed her how carefully she'd been ignoring the possibility of failure. The trail led her around the base of one of the towers. A pair of dog-like constructs were worrying at a shard of crystal. Lying on the ground next to it, Tanaka could see the gap at the top of the tower, where it must have broken off and fallen. In the files, Laconian intelligence called these things repair drones and indicated that they were non-threatening. Occasionally, they'd wander into the fringes of the city and steal broken things, only to later return them repaired but altered. Researching what they chose to fix and how they went about intuiting original function was one of the projects that the Science Directorate was going to get around to one of these days. The suit indicated that the High Consul scent was on one of the drones. Tanaka scowled to herself. If Duarte had left his scent on the thing by touching it, if that was the trail she was following, she was screwed. They could have interacted anywhere. Before the dog came here, and she'd have no idea where Duarte and this thing had met up, she was about to go, searching for another trace of the scent, when one of the dogs said Kikako, then picked up the broken crystal shard in its weird, puppet-like mouth and wandered off. She followed it. After a confusing series of twists and turns, they emerged into another chamber, 10 times the size of anything she'd seen before in the tunnels. It was like stepping into a cathedral, a floating sound, like wind over the top of empty bottles, muttered through the space with no clear origin. Strange, almost organic-looking mechanisms grew up from the floor and towered over her, 10 or 15 stories high. For an instant she felt something like awe. In among them were half a dozen pits, filled with viscous brown fluid, like sewer water mixed with petroleum oil. The dog walked over and dropped its broken bit of crystal into one of the pools, then waited motionless. The suit warned her that there were 11 other mobiles in the cabin, each of them another one of the weird dog things. None seemed hostile as she watched. They brought things into the room and dropped them in the pools. One time a dog took something resembling a half-meter of water pipe out of the pool and then left with it. "This your machine shop puppy?" she asked. "What are you doing here?" Tanaka raised her arm and fired half a dozen shots into one of the motionless dogs, blowing it apart. She waited. After a few moments, 3 of the other dogs came over and began gently picking up the pieces of their dead comrade and dumping them into the pools. "Aha," Tanaka said to them. "Fixing your friend up, aren't you? All right, I'll wait." They just looked back at her with their big eyes, as though they were embarrassed at her outburst. One said, "Kekaku," but didn't move. There are a lot of strange chemicals in the air in the chamber, and the suit took a while sorting through them all. But after a few moments, it popped up an alert: Duarte's scent. It was a significant trace. She had a hard time believing that it was just contact with a repair drone. If he passed through that room, had he been hurt or killed and the dogs brought him there? Had he figured out the same thing she just did and used the sewage pools to fix something? Her hands itched a little bit and she grinned. She felt the impatience of the chase, like she was a dog straining at its leash. At the smell of rabbits, the joy of the hunt, slowly, methodically, she moved around the perimeter, looking for the strongest match. Tracing Duarte's movement inside the room was probably pointless, but knowing where he'd come from and what direction he'd left would be enough. The best hit was a tunnel leading off the large cavern and gently sloping up. She followed it, the chemical scent growing stronger as she moved. Half an hour later, she emerged into a large room with an open window to the outside. The chamber was shaped like a half circle, with a flat wall nearly 60 meters across the middle. 20 meters of the wall were missing, creating a large opening to the outside. Sunlight streamed in, sky glowed oxygen blue. Between the draping strands of vine and branch. He'd been here more than that. He'd spent time here. Duarte's scent marker was everywhere. "High Consul," she said, the suit amplifying her. "This is Colonel Tanaka. If you're here, I just want to talk with you, sir." No one answered. On either side of the beyond opening were spindly cradles growing up from the floor, with 15-meter-long egg-shaped objects held. In them, the eggs had the same mother-of-pearl gleam she'd seen in the interior of a Gravitor-class battleship, like something made at the alien construction platform. And the High Consul's most recent scent track moved up to the empty cradle in the center. She walked slowly around the cradle, but no track LED away. "All right, little buddy," she said to the egg that had been there and was gone. "What the fuck are you?" a ship, Dr. Okita said. Tanaka leaned back in her chair. She'd taken over an office in the state building as her base of operations, with a staff of 10 and high priority. Access to everyone of any importance to the Empire. The decor was generic politician, but she'd put a print of Amon Fitzwallace's Artemis the Hunter on the wall where she could see it. Or vibrant green with shocks of bright and bloody red. "You're sure?" "Well, no," Uchiha said. "We have a team going to the side now as you requested. We'll know more once that's complete, but we have seen similar structures elsewhere. Persephone system, but Igaun Swaga Loka 7 Kings. It's not the most common, but it's certainly not unprecedented. A fair proportion of the artifactory seems focused on material transport, and especially in the 7 Kings data. We see probably a ship, that's oversimplifying. We believe they were material transport parts." Okita said, "But did it fly?" The location and design seemed to indicate yes. Dr. Okita agreed with a nod. "Then how do we track it?" Okita leaned forward. His chair creaked under him and he blinked like an owl. "Track it." Tanaka clenched her fist, where the scientist couldn't see it, and kept her voice. "Even if I wanted to find where the ship went, is there a drive signature? I can search for some kind of energy profile." Okita shook his head like she was a little girl. Who'd asked him for a unicorn? The native propulsion systems aren't something we've cracked yet. Not for want of trying, but we've known since he was moved that it involves decoupling local inertia from frame inertia. That's not something that has a drive. It seems more like a controlled gravity, where a non-local area falls through normal space. "Okay," Tanaka said, not punching the grinning scientist in the face. "Only through great effort of will. No drive plume. Then what can I use to find it?" Eros was also invisible to radar, you recall. "You're telling me a lot of things I can't do." "Start telling me what's on the can list," Okita shrugged. Eros was at least always visually available. If the ship passed through any light telescopy, you might find it that way, of course after the attack. The planetary defenses are compromised, so he pressed his lips together in a universal gesture of impotence. "All right," Tanaka said. "Thank you. You're quite welcome." "No." She said, "I mean you're dismissed." Okita blinked in surprise, but then he left, so that was good. Tanaka ate. She barely begun, and her search area had just expanded from Laconia, at or near a transport network, to literally any place in 1,300 systems, and no obvious path to narrow it down. The raw frustration of it was a knot between her shoulder blades. She pulled up a notepad and started thinking. Her options through signal intelligence was obvious. Images of the remaining egg ship, said to be put out to anything with visual telescopes, station ships, anything near a ring gate. The voice of the whirlwind, the only surviving magnetor, was acting as Erzart's planetary defense. It would be the priority. If it had seen the egg ship, that would at least give her an idea what direction it was going. It was possible, after all, that Duarte had been going someplace in system. She didn't know for sure he'd been headed for a gate. And then what? Hunting a ship that couldn't be tracked on radar. That didn't leave a drive plume that ran dark. If she knew what he'd been going after, maybe would give her a smaller list of possible destinations. She'd need to talk to the valet and Admiral Trejo to see if Duarte had given any hint where he might be heading. Or maybe hunting wasn't the right model. Maybe trapping was. Maybe it wasn't a place Duarte was heading for. If the High Console was looking for something, that thing could be used as bait. The records of ongoing operations were highly restricted. Trejo was probably the only one who could access everything, but he'd given her the keys. There were 5 active groups trying to recover Teresa Duarte. She read over their operating reports, but half of her mind was probing the strategy. Before his resurrection, the only sign Duarte had given that he was still conscious was his slaughter of Paula Cortázar, that, according to Dr. Okoye, who had been there at the time, had been out of concern for his daughter. Was it such a stretch to think that the girl would be the initially person he reached out to? Now, wasn't she the best available bait? It sure as hell seemed like better odds than tracking the missing ship. The most promising lead was an intelligence counter-up, a distant cousin of Duarte's dead wife. Ran a boarding school on New Egypt, and there had been some chatter between her and known underground contacts if Tanaka had the girl. It was the sort of place she'd have found to park her. And the school's new term was starting soon. Hiding a teenage girl in a place with a lot of other teenage girls made sense. Tanaka pulled up the command structure. The operation was being run through a hunting frigate called the Sparrowhawk. Captain Noel Mugabo was in charge, or had been anyway until now. She opened a connection to her aide and didn't wait for him to speak. Contact the Sparrowhawk and let them know I'll be taking over direct operational command of their New Egypt mission. And find me a fast transport, something with breathable fluid. Crash couches, put me on New Egypt now. Chapter 6, Naomi Amos, or the thing that had been Amos. Smiled and waited for the auto dark to finish its run. Naomi brazed at a handhold, watched the values and scans as they spooled out. Red and amber and occasionally green. They were the medical equivalent of a shrug, the machine thought. He was a basket full of different kinds of strange. Some was the strange he'd been ever since returning from Laconia. Some was new, strange that deviated from previous measures. Whether any of it was significant was anybody's guess. There was no comparison data for an animal like him. No others of his kind apart from the pair that Elvie Okoye had. There was no context. Naomi felt that way a lot these days. "I'm feeling fine," he said. "That's good. You should stay here for a while anyway. In case it happens again." The pure black eyes shifted. It was hard to tell if he was focusing on her or something else in the room. Without iris or pupil, he could appear all-seeing and blind at the same moment. "I don't think I'll be getting the wigglies again anytime soon," he said. "You've been pretty shaken up. Not just this, all of it. Better that we get an idea what's going on with you now, so you don't have another seizure while you're doing something dangerous. I get that, but it's not gonna happen again. You can't know that unless we know why it happened." "Yeah." They were quiet for a moment, only the hum of the air recyclers and the muttering of the auto dock. "Do you? Do I what, boss? Do you know why the seizure happened?" Amos lifted a wide grayish hand in a gesture that said, "Maybe, maybe not." The little widening of his smile was exactly the one he'd have used before, but half a second later than he would have used it. "I got a feeling." The stuff running the background with a new head, that was a hiccup. "Don't think it'll happen again." She tried to smile back, but it felt forced. "That's not as reassuring as you think. You don't think I'm him, do you?" She noted the pronoun him, not you don't think I'm me. "I don't even know what that question means." "It's all right, I get it. I went away like I used to be. I come back with these eyes and this blood, and my brain doing things it didn't used to do. If you weren't at least wondering, that would be weird." Are you still human?" His smile could have meant anything. "Not sure I ever was really. But I know it's still me. That'll do then," she said, and made herself lean over and kiss his wide, smooth scalp, the way she might have if she hadn't had doubts. If it was true and he was Amos, then it was the right thing. If it wasn't, and he wasn't, better that whoever he was believe she accepted him or still. "Wait an hour before you get back to work beside, if you say so." She squeezed his shoulder and it was solid. Had it felt like that before, Amos had always been strong. He'd spent as much time in the ship gym as Bobby, and Bobby had damn near lived there. Naomi couldn't tell if this was a change or just her mind looking for discrepancies, building them whether they were there or not. "I'll check on you," she said. Because it wasn't a lie no matter what she meant by it. The ring space wasn't somewhere to relax. There had been a time when it had been. The hub of humanity's great spread to the stars. It seemed safe then, or relatively so. Anything that found its way to the edge of the sphere, defined by the ring gates, vanished and was lost. But nothing reached back until it did, and then it had been annihilating. Now most ships moved through it fast and hot, setting the angle of their transit before they came in, and getting out the farther gate as quickly as they could. It was exactly the wrong thing to keep from going, Dutchman, but it minimized the time spent in the uncanny space. Other ships passed in and out of the rings. The traffic of more than 1,000 systems, all of them relying on trade to one degree or another. All of the ships on their own errands, with no particular interest in, nor awareness of Naomi and her burdens. The Rosie stayed there on the float. Every hour caught the danger. That reality itself would start boiling again, and everything in the ring space would be killed. But before they could go anywhere, they needed a place to go, and a plan that was more fleshed out than don't die. She worked on the ops deck, floating just over her crash couch, with her legs folded in the lotus position. The straps shifted around her, like kelp in a vast water recycling tank, and the web of the underground spread out on the screen before her. It had been easier when she'd been focused on attacking Laconia. Breaking things was always easier than building them up. In the aftermath of Laconia's defeat in its home system, on its home planet, the Dominion had moved to consolidate the power it still had. Trejo was locking down shipyards and supply lines as best he could with the units that remained. To him, Naomi was trying to leverage the influence and organization she gathered for the battle into some kind of sustainable, self-governing network. The news feeds from Sol, Baragon Oberon, and Saga Minor chattered about increased Laconian presence, though why anyone was worried about a backwater like Svega wasn't entirely clear. The message queue was as long as her arm, it felt like. Their objection is the same one we're seeing over and over again, Jillian Houston, the captain of the underground stolen flagship, said. From Naomi's screen, she looked like a child. She was older than Naomi had been when she'd signed onto the Canterbury a lifetime ago. By fan system is on the edge of being self-sustaining, but which side of the edge is debatable. They don't like anyone saying when they can and can't trade, and they're absolutely not going to accept constraints that other systems aren't abiding by, and I have to say I'm sympathetic. We're here to protect people's freedom. I'm not sure what liberty is if you're not permitted to decide what chances you're willing to take Naomi turned her head, trying to ease the knot at the base of her skull. She'd watched the report 3 times now. Each time, hoping she'd find a graceful and diplomatic response. That had eluded her before. It hadn't happened. Instead, she felt herself growing taut and angry. The tension in her neck, the tightness across her chest, pulling her shoulders forward into a hunch, the ache at the corners of her skull. They were the physical manifestations of an impatience that reached far beyond Jillian's message or her own still uncomposed response. She kept coming back to the unchartable thought that if the underground were just made up of belters, the problem would have been tractable, or if not that, at least you'd have been sure solution existed. Belters were viciously independent, but they also understood what it meant to rely on the community around them. Skipping a SEAL replacement didn't only risk the life of the slack bastards who cheaped out on their work. Failure meant the death of everyone on the crew. The colony worlds were acting like their safety could exist separate from the well-being of all the other systems and ships. It couldn't be so hard to see how accepting a little restriction and regulation benefited everyone. But Inner World's culture didn't measure it that way. For them, being better meant being better than the person next to you, not both of you sharing the same increase. She knew it wasn't fair or even really accurate. Her frustration was leaking out as tribalism and spite, which was why she hadn't responded yet, even though as the de facto leader of the underground, she had to. What you really wanted to do was put a camera on Jim and have him give one of his heartfelt little sermons about how they were all one people, and that by pulling together, they'd get to the other side of their struggles. It was his genius that he could still believe that, even after everything they'd seen and been through. But she'd just gotten him back if she let herself get into the habit of seeing him as a useful tool. For her work, it would betray the chance they'd been given. She needed to have the connection between them as something separates something sacred that the rest of the universe didn't have claim on. So maybe there was a thread of selfishness and belters, too. She started the recording. Jillian, thank you for your report. Please let our friends in by Fund System know that I hear and understand their concerns. And I absolutely understand their need for safety and equity, and how trade is carried out through the rings. The goal has to be minimizing the need for ring transit by building up to sustainability for all the colonies as quickly as possible, and their goal for that is absolutely the same as ours. I'll include the presentation for why the protocols are the best, safest way forward for all of us. And you can pass that along too. Hopefully they've already seen it. But maybe this time they'll actually pay attention. Or maybe the Builder's ancient enemy would figure out how to end all human life. And none of this would matter. Fatalism had its dark attractions. After all, hopelessness and despair could almost look restful. She played back her message, decided that it sounded to Pat, and rehearsed and redid it another 4 times before she gave up and sent it out. The message queue still waiting looked like forever. She massaged her hands, digging into the aching muscles at the base of her thumbs, while the next message played on her screen. Governor Tuan had thin terrier, sharp cheeks, frog-wet eyes, gray-black hair, and a tight, vicious smile. She wondered whether she would still have thought he was ugly. If he'd had a different personality, she'd probably have been more forgiving. On behalf of the Governing Council of Fyodos, I would like to thank you for submitting your proposal. I am very interested in returning to a schedule of reliable and mutually profitable trade. But Naomi said to herself, as to unskull theatrically on the screen. There are, however, some very real concerns about the document as it stands that will require some thoughtful conversation. In that spirit, I would like to propose a summit meeting While Fjordos is not yet entirely self-sustaining, we do have certain amenities that we will be happy to offer. Our state-of-the-art luxury villas can be set aside for you and your associates. For as long as the negotiations take, she slid it into a secondary queue. There was only so much explaining to people. How cooperation would keep them all from dying, she could manage in a single sitting. The next entry stopped her. It was from Seoul. It was from Kit. The only child of Alex's second marriage was a grown individual now, but she'd seen him as a newborn and known his mother. Giselle, as well as any of the Rosie crew, had really gotten to know her. Now here he was looking into a camera. He looks more like his mother, Giselle's high, sharp cheekbones and regal forehead and brows. When he moved, she could see Alex in him. "Hey," he said. "So I know it's been a while and things. I know it's not like we could be in touch more, but I wanted to let you know something." Naomi's gut tightened and she braced for a hit. That kid had come to her. Had to mean it was something about Alex, or something that would hurt Alex badly enough. That Kit wanted to be sure there would be people there to comfort him, even if he decided to keep it to himself. "Well," Kid said, "there aren't a lot of planetary engineering gigs, and Soul System and the ones there are, they have 15 people applying for every spot. I know that we talked about me keeping a low profile." Naomi frowned, trying to remember when she'd said something like that. "But we got offered a contract with a geological survey on New Wastad. It's a good company, Jacob and Black Combined Capital. They're doing a lot of industrial construction and microclimate engineering, and I think it could be a really good move for us. But it will make it harder for you to come visit, and I know with Rohi pregnant, you'd want to see your grandson." Kit grinned, like he just delivered the punchline to a joke, and Naomi stopped the playback. Relief was like a drug in her veins. She leaned back in her crash couch, the gimbals hissing under her, and called up toward the flight deck. "Alex, I think I got some of your mail. I'll send it up." But he was already coming down the lift ladder. "What's up?" he said. "I got some of your mail. It's in the intelligence packet, but it's yours from Kit." His smile was quick and automatic. "Well, play it." Naomi scrubbed the message back to the start and let it play. Knowing what was coming, she watched his face and saw the shock and the joy, and the tears in Alex's eyes when the news landed. Kit went on for a time, telling Alex about the dates they were shipping out for a newest out and the due date for the coming child, and some news of no real importance about Giselle and life on Mars. And then the message ended with Kit saying, "I love you, Dad," and Alex lowering himself into the crash couch at Naomi's side. "Well, ain't that a kick in the nuts?" Alex said through a wide grin. "I'm going to be a granddaddy." "Yes, you are." He considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "I was going to say I'm too young to be anyone's grandfather, but I'm not. Am I? No, Nami said you aren't. If anything, you ran kind of late. Took a while to get it right. God gets a good kid, I hope. He's better at keeping a marriage together than I was." "He isn't you. I'm not saying he won't fuck it all up. But even if he does, it'll be how he fucks it up, not how you did." For an instant, she thought of her own son dead, along with his father and the rest of the Free Navy. The memory almost didn't hurt. That wasn't true. It would always hurt. But now it was a low-level ache. Instead of a knife to the belly, time had done its healing. Or at least let the scars go numb. The piloting subsystem chimed, and Alex holed himself up out of the couch. "I guess Giselle is going to be a grandmother." He grinned, "And she's gonna hate the shit out of it." "Isn't she? The title may not fit her self-image." Naomi said. "You make a good diplomat," Alex said, and headed back for the lift. When she was alone again, she separated Kit's message from the rest of the packet and copied it over to Alex's message queue. She thought about keeping a copy for herself, but it hadn't been meant for her. As she didn't want to presume, a soft clicking alert and a new message popped up on her queue. She built a system of flags to help her keep track of her cascading responsibilities. This flag was the deep gold color that she'd chosen to mean home, issue specific, and peculiar to the Rosinante and her little family. What remained of her little family? The message was the one Naomi had been waiting for. Its tracking headers showed the subtle signs and countersigns the underground used to confirm authenticity. The repeaters echoed back to New Egypt as she'd hoped. Nothing looked a mess, anything that touched on the daughter of High Consul Winston Duarte Naomi, treated like it was made from snakes and plutonium, once she was certain of the message. Protocols and origins, she isolated her calm system, offered a silent prayer to the universe, and decrypted the message. It was a single line of text. Admission approved for fall semester. Chapter 7 Jim. Why am I only hearing about this now? Teresa asked. Jim couldn't tell if the tension was anger, fear, or something else, but it had settled around the girl's shoulders. Like a shoal, her eyes were focused someplace, just over Jim's right shoulder, fixed and glaring, in a way that he knew from his time on Laconia. Was her way of listening intently. It was strange to think that of all of them, Jim had spent the most time with Teresa. They lived in the state building for years. Hers the child of the High Consul, and him as his prisoner. Or maybe both as his prisoners, just in different ways. That was me, he said. I didn't want to float the possibility. If it didn't come through her. Gaze flicked to him with a question. I didn't want to disappoint you, he said. But it came through. It's here, a possibility. It's a boarding school in the New Egypt system, Sohag Presbyterian Academy. I'm not interested in a religious education. She said, it's not really specifically religious. I mean, there are religious classes and services, but they aren't mandatory. Teresa took an instant processing that, like she'd taken a bite of food, and was deciding whether to spit it out. A cousin, she said. Elizabeth Finley, she was your mother's cousin, and apparently doesn't think much of your father. It's kind of perfect. She knows who you are, and can take steps to keep you safe. And she's not interested in bowing before Laconia, for personal reasons, so we don't have to worry about her deciding to hand you over for a bounty. And you vetted her. The underground did what it could. She seems to check out. There's not a big presence in New Egypt, Laconian or underground. That's another part of the appeal. Teresa's gaze floated back over his shoulder as she thought. Like all the cabins in the Rosie, Teresa's had been designed for Martian military. Back when that it still meant something. Jim was used to the Spartan design for himself. For the others, putting an adolescent girl in the same setting made it seem more like a prison. At 15, Jim had been a sophomore at North French Town High. The issues he'd struggled with were how to sleep an extra 20 minutes in the mornings, how to cover over his profound disinterest in Mr. Lawrence chemistry lectures, and whether Deliverance Benavides would go out with him. Back then, all of Montana had seemed too small. Teresa only had a few square meters. What about Muskrat? Finley says it won't be a problem. There are other students who have pets too, mostly their service animals. But it won't stand out enough to cause trouble. I don't know, she said. I like it here. Amos is teaching me things, and there are fewer variables here. I would know the people there. I don't think I trust them. I hear you, Jim said. But this is a warship, and we're at war, and while you did pull us out of the fire, I'm not comfortable using you as a shield. I'm a good shield. Yeah, but I'm done with that play. Why, she asked. I know you don't want to, but it worked, and it'll keep working, at least sometimes. Why didn't you want something that works to keep you safe? The sincerity in her voice surprised him. Shields take the hit, Jim said. Shields get shot. That's what they're there for, and someday, someone is going to think that they can disable the row. See, by putting a round through our drive cone, or that it's worth the risk to drop a few rail gun rounds through us. There's a calculus here, and yes, you make them less likely to shoot us down. But I don't want to be the guy you died for. I'm not okay with it. She tilted her head like she was hearing a new sound. You care about this? Yeah, kind of do. If you'd expected an outpouring of emotion from her, gratitude or admiration, or just respect for the morality of his position, he picked the wrong girl. She considered him like he was an unexpected kind of butterfly. It wasn't quite contempt, but it wasn't not contempt either. He saw something occur to her and waited until she was ready to say it. If I went and I didn't like it there, could I come back? Probably not, he said, and then an instant later, no. The sorrow in her expression was brief, but it was deep. He understood a little better the loss he was asking her to embrace. I need to think about this, she said. When do you need my answer? When Naomi had come to him with the news, she'd asked him to tell Teresa. Not ask permission, not negotiate with. The verb had been tell, and yet here he was. Jim scratched his neck. It's weeks until the term starts. I'd like to get you there, early enough to have you situated. But if we make it relatively hard burn, I understand, she said. I won't take too long. He pulled himself out of the room, skimming down the corridor. He heard the door close behind him. The ship was quiet. Naomi was waiting for him on the flight deck. He was going to have to tell her that a 15-year-old girl had maneuvered him into giving her the choice of going to boarding school or staying on the ship. He guessed doing something that wasn't Naomi's plan. It was barely his responsibility. And he still felt like he'd screwed it up. He passed Alex's cabin and heard the familiar voice drifting through the door. But it will make it harder for you to come visit. And I know with Rohi pregnant, you'd want to see your grandson. Alex had been smiling a lot since the message came through. But he knew there was something else there too. Jim wanted to be happy for him, and he thought he was faking it pretty well. He slapped Alex on the back and made Grandpa jokes that made his old friend grin. The truth was, Jim was astounded by Kit's optimism, and by astounded he really meant horrified, when Alex talked about his grandson, working out whether he'd been born yet, how big he was likely to be, speculating on the names that Kit and his wife might choose. All Jim could see was one more body on the pile. When the end came, another baby who'd stop breathing. When the deep enemy solved its puzzle, another death. Maybe that was unfair. There had been any number of end times before this. Black Plague, nuclear war, food web collapse, arrows moving. Every generation had its apocalypse if they made humans stop falling in love and having babies, celebrating and dreaming and living out the time they had. They'd have stopped a long time before. It was just that this time it was different. This time they weren't going to make it. The only other one who knew, who understood, was Amos, and so Amos was the only one he could talk to. He made his way down toward the reactor and the drive. The smell of silicon lubricant sweetened the air, and muskrat, soft bark drew him toward the engineering deck. The dog was floating in the air, her tail a circular whirl that left her head shifting in a circle a few centimeters across. Her lips were pulled back in a wide canine smile. Still no sausage, Jim said, and the dog barked softly. She doesn't actually care about that, Amos said. She just likes having you around. Jim studied the dog with one hand and petted her with the other. You know, I would have said dog on spaceship was a very bad plan. But I do kind of like having her here. I mean, more when we're under thrust. Amos rose from a workstation, a small welding torch in one hand, and dark goggles to protect his eyes pushed up onto his forehead. A hydraulic valve was clamped at the station, with a line of scorch marks along the ceramic. Where the metal sealant was still cooling, she does get embarrassed. When I have to take her to the vacuum, fire hydrant. But what it's the idiom for where dogs piss. Amos said I don't make this up. I just follow the network groups. Because there's a lot of floating puppies. Jim said to Muskrat, you're not the only one. They cope with atrophy better than us too. Amos said as he stripped off the goggles and fit them into his tool case. Something about having more legs on the ground. I think probably I will miss her when she's gone, Jim said, then nodded at the valve. Is there a problem with the water feed? Nope, and there isn't going to be. Mineralization was messing with the seal, and you wait until that's bad enough. For a little erosion, you might as well print up a new one. You know I at least have it on good authority. That's close enough for me. Amos snapped the welding torch into its place and pulled a polishing cloth out of his pocket. We need to get the fuck out of the slow zone. Hanging out here like this is making my scalp crawl. Yeah, as soon as Naomi gets through her data and decides for sure where we're going. Jim said, I'm worried about the kid. Yeah, me too. It's easy for me to forget how much she's lost, you know. Her entire experience was curated to the millimeter. Before she came with us a few months here, just enough to get comfortable and find her feet. And now another total change. It's a lot. She's 15. Can you imagine facing all that at 15? Amos looked over at him like he'd said something funny. You stressed over Tiny. She's gonna be fine. Is she, I mean? What do we even know about this school? We're taking her to. We know it gets shot at less than we do. Besides that, Amos put the cloth over his thumb, took a firm grip on the valve, and started rubbing away the scorch marks as he talked. Tiny's working out who she is shit. What she is, it's what she was doing on Laconia. That's what she's doing here when she goes to that school. It's not like the job changes. The question is, does she have more to learn? From a boarding school at the end of nowhere, or getting missiles thrown at her with a bunch of old fart revolutionaries. I don't think we're really revolutionaries. And Amos went on, raising his voice to keep Jim from changing the subject. It's not what's really eating you. We both know that. Before Jim could reply, Alex's voice came over shipwide. Hey everybody, I was hoping. I kind of need to call a little group meeting. In the galley, if you can, thanks. Amos squinted at the valve, turning it one way and then the other, before giving it a last satisfied swipe with the cloth. He set it back in its clamp. Do you need to put that back in place? Nah, Amos said. I got a spare holding the line for now. Then I guess we should go see what's up with Alex. He wants something, but he needs to apologize for a few minutes before he asks. Well, sure, Jim said. I mean, I wonder what he's going to ask for. If there had been gravity, Alex would have been pacing. When they came through the galley door, Teresa was already there, floating beside the wall without touching it. Her arms were crossed, her mouth was tight and small, and every now and then she moved her jaw and made some brief expression. If he had to guess, Jim would have said she was in deep conversation with herself. And barely paying focus to them, Amos took a place at the table, rooting himself by his mag boots to keep his hands free. To steady Muskrat, the dog seemed perfectly at ease, reassured by having so much of its pack together. Naomi came last and pulled herself a bulb of tea, while motioning to Alex that he could start. So yeah, Alex said, you all heard about Kit and Rohi, right? You may have mentioned it, Jim said, teasing him. But gently Alex grinned. So I did the math, and I'm pretty sure that the baby's already born. Now I know that we have a lot on our plates here. The work we're doing is really crucial and risky. I didn't sign on to any of this thinking it was like A normal contract. This has never been a normal contract. Amos's sigh was almost inaudible. Alex heard it anyway. And Jim could see the old pilot dropping. Minutes of talking around the subject. Communication is dangerous for him and for us. But I would really like to send my boy a message, you know. Maybe get a picture of my grandson. I don't know what we have. Or what the underground needs from us. If we can't, I just had to ask. You know, if it was something we could, and I just didn't. Jim turned to Naomi and lifted his chin, asking. She took a sip from the bulb. It would mean poking our nose through the soul gate. She said, we could get a tight beam through. Trusted repeaters from there. Any gate's just about as far as any other one right now. Jim said, I mean, we just have to keep pretending we were on the same fake contract as before. Even if Laconia has units in the system, there's no better system to get lost in the traffic. Sol's got a few centuries worth of ships and infrastructure to blend in with. It's not like we'd be trying to go unnoticed in Arcadia or far home. It would be more risk, Alex said. But he was just trying to tell them that. He wouldn't be angry if they said no. Jim, Naomi, and Amos had all shipped with him long enough to know that was true. He wouldn't be angry. But he would be sad, and if they were all going to die anyway, there was no reason to miss the chance. I think we should go, he said. I was hoping we could drop Teresa off at school and then head for Fairdos, Naomi said. The soul gate's right here, Jim said, a quick burn. If there aren't any guard ships right at the ring gate, we can flip as soon as we've passed through the gate. Amos scratched his neck. We got enough water out of Kronos. We're not hurting for reaction mass. We could probably make up the time by burning a little longer. To and from New Egypt, we're still hurting on fuel pellets and recyclers. But a little detour like that won't matter for those. Fine, Naomi said, so gate for long enough to contact kits. Then New Egypt we resupply, and Firdos. That work for you, Tiny? Amos asked. Teresa snapped back to the room from wherever she'd been. There was a bright sheen of tears over her eyes, not thick but present. Yes, fine. Yes, Alex's relief melted him when he spoke. His voice was ready and thick. Thank you, really. If we hadn't got to live with it, but just thank you. Family is crucial, Naomi said. And Jim couldn't tell which of the 1,000 things she could have meant by it were in her mind. It took less than an hour to get the Rosie ready to go. Even with Amos swapping and testing the repaired valve, Alex on the flight deck above them was singing to himself like a finch at dawn. There wasn't a melody to speak of, just the musical lilting of pleasure and anticipation. Amos, Teresa, and Muskrat were in engineering, and Jim was thinking about all the things the girl might be feeling: abandonment, anger, rejection. He hoped it wasn't like that, or that at least there were other things: anticipation, curiosity, hope, to 11 them. He hoped without any reason to hope that it would matter, and that Teresa would by some miracle live long enough to work through the complications of her own heart. As they started the burn for Soul Ring at half a G instead of the usual third, Naomi sighed. At first, he thought her mind was on the same things as his. Too many fucking ships going through the rings, she said, and here we are not exactly leading by example. He looked at the tactical. She was right, of course. Just in the time they'd been at a relative stop, so that she could read through the data, 10 more ships had passed through the gates, burning on one errand or another that someone decided was worth the risk, or didn't understand that there was a risk, or didn't care. You saw there was another event? Naomi asked. There was a message from Okoya. It happened in the Gadara system. How many does that make? 20, something like that. Alex above them burst into a little run of melody. Something bright and jazzy, and as full of springtime. It was like listening to a message from a different universe. She figure it out, Naomi said, answering Jim's silence. If anyone can, she will. As they dove down toward the fluttering interference surface that was the gateway to Seoul, a fast transit ship burst through the Laconia gate. Behind them, flipped and started a punishing maneuvering burn. Jim watched them, waiting for the tight beam demanding their surrender. It didn't come. Looks like we skipped out at just the right time, Naomi said. Another near miss, Jim said. Don't know how many more of those we're going to get. They passed through the Seoul gate. Before they could see where the fast transport was headed, interlude the dreamer. The dreamer dreams, and her dream carries her and hers, flowing backward into a time before minds, like grandmothers telling the stories. Their grandmothers informed about their grandmothers. Before them, she falls gently and forever into black oceans, the size of everything, the other two are and aren't, and are again with her and within her. Like coming to the memory of songs she never quite forgot, she broadens like a sunbird, spreading its wings to catch the warming light. But there is no sun and no light, not yet, and the cold darkness is wide and comforting as a bed. And she knows things once and gone so far away. No one was there to think it. It was like this. Down was the hardness of heat, and up was the hardness of cold. And between those two implicabilities was the universe. The dreamer dreams the currents of flow and force, and her blood is the ocean's blood. Her salt is the ocean's salt, with a hand as wide, is continent and softer than her skin. She caresses the burning heat below her, and the soothing cool above. Long yins and nothing is alive until something is. Maybe many things are, but the dream is a middle dream. And she dreams the middle, because the path that crooks her swimmingly on begins there, but slowly, slowly slow. The dreamer drifts and the others drift with her. And more now, little bulbs of pastness around her and within, drifting on the same flow that she is and that she is. To touch and become one thins itself into two and two and two and two. She watches the language lightless, stuttering in the blessed cold. As the grandmothers whisper that, here is the birth of lust, hear the puppy-wise gamble of making, for the joy of making. With nothing to make of but from self more self, the dreamer forgets, and is the slowness. She reaches over timelessness and invisibilities, thirsty for something richer than water. Thimble feasts rise from below and set her for decades, and she dreams that she is dreaming. Safe inside the eternal flow, her hand reaches up to her heel, fingertips stretching her head to brush her toes. She is a child made of salt water bubbles. And one of the others says, so like cells, but the words are another place. And she is voluptuous now beyond all language. There is no light not yet, but there is heat far, far below. Stuttering and buzzing and raging, it boils up the strange taste of stones that draws her and drives her away and becomes her. Above the cold where nothing flows, the endless curving wall around the universe, and the ripple now the always ripple of a flow. Inside the flow that only some things feel, a handhold in the waters, a something made from nothing that she shimmies, wriggling along. She presses herself against it and lusty she improvises. The little bulbs of pastness complicate and reach, one for another and for the initially time and all of time. She is tired. Watch, watch, watch the grandmothers whisper. Feel that one that falls slippingly down, too far into the heat and riot. That mindless genius, this is crucial, they say. And the dreamer draws herself down to and others. How many with her sink? The bubble rises full of thrum and fever and ill. And when it cools, it is butterscotch on the tongue. And a billion insects choiring, joyful in the summer night. It is 1,000 new toys wrapped in gauze and ribbon. It is coffee and candy and the initially awkward kiss. Almost shattering against the skin. And she knows she will go again, that she who is a child of bubbles will send herself away again to be burned, and then cherish her blisters. She longs to be made strange by the hotness and the hurt. This is how it was when we were girls. The grandmothers say, and the dreamer dreams that she understands. That's enough, someone says. All right, people, by the numbers and by the book. Chapter 8. LV Foz, floating at her personal desk, scrolled through the notes whenever he was confused or skeptical. A little line appeared between his eyebrows. So does this make any fucking sense to you? Because I'm baffled. The notes have the scans of Kara's brain and body, and the ones of the BFE, but the crucial part for LV was the interview and subject report with Kara. It had taken them hours to complete. LV asking questions and Kara answering verbally, or writing out her reply, and while it was the least objective thing in the report, it was also the thing that excited her most. It does, I think it does, LV said and paused. I have some ideas. He shut down the window and turned his focus to her. Maybe you better tell me then. Because I don't know what I'm looking at here. She gathered her thoughts. Exobiology hadn't been LV's initially field of concentration. Back in the dim and ancient times that were really just a few, wild and change-filled decades before, she'd gone to Sejong World College because it had the best medical genetics program that she could afford. When she was being honest with herself, it wasn't even that she loved medical genetics all that much. When she was 15, she'd seen Emily Erdala play a medical geneticist and Handful of Rain, and she spent the next year trying to get her hair to look the same. She never really managed. The weird alchemy of adolescent imprinting transformed her unconsidered identification with an entertainment feed actor into an interest in how strands of DNA turned into pathologies. The idea of a flaw as tiny as a mist base pair, translating itself into a slightly different curve on a protein, and then into a leaking heart valve or a non-functional eye, was compelling and creepy. In more or less equal degrees, she thought that it was her passion, and she'd followed it with the dedication of a woman who believed she was on the path the universe wanted for her. She'd taken a course on non-terrestrial fieldwork because her advisor had pointed out how many more postings there were for newly graduated medical geneticists on Mars and the stations on Jupiter's and Saturn's moons than there were on Earth. LV had taken the hint. Lectures had been held in a small room with yellow, water-stained carpet and a wall screen with a burned-out pixel that made it look like there was a fly on it. Professor Lee was 3 years into his retirement and only came back to teach the class because he liked it. Maybe his enthusiasm had been infectious, or maybe it had all been the universe's way of putting her in the right place at the right time, whatever the reason or lack of reason. Professor Lee had done a section about the initially explorations for extraterrestrial life in the oceans of Europa, and Elvis' brain had lit up like someone had put euphorics in her breakfast cereal, to the dismay of her mother and her academic advisor. She changed her focus to the then purely hypothetical field of exobiology. Her advisor's exact words had been, from a work perspective, you'd be better off learning to tune pianos. And that had been true right up until Eros moved. After everybody in her program had jobs for life. She was older now than Professor Lee had been when he informed her about Europa and those initially tentative efforts to show that Earth's tree of life wasn't alone in the universe. She'd seen things she hadn't dreamed of, been places she hadn't known existed when she was a girl, and found herself, thanks to chance and James fucking Holden, at the razor's edge of the most crucial research projects in human history. Strange then how it all cycled back to Professor Lee's lecture about Europa, cold dead Europa, which it turned out to never have had any life in it, but opened up the universe to her anyway. Elvie studied herself with a handhold. She'd been on the float long enough that it came almost naturally now. She still missed being able to pace. Okay, how much do you know about this slow life model? I am now aware that there is something called a slow life model, right? Basics. Okay, so there's a range of metabolic rates. You can see that in animals. You have something fast with a high reproduction rate, like rats or chickens on one hand, and tortoises with a really long lifespan and a much slower metabolism on the other. The whole tree of life is on that spectrum. It predicts that you'd see things evolving in very low energy environments that, needed very little energy. Low metabolisms, low reproduction. Long lifespan, slow life. Space turtles, ice turtles. Actually very cold saltwater slugs or jellyfish. Probably something pretty near neutral buoyancy. That's not the point. You could, in theory, have something evolve in an environment with very little available energy and with a very, let's call it, leisurely sense of time. It's what the Terrascova missions were looking for, and that's awesome, Fire said blankly. Terrace Cover 1 and 2, with the initially long-term crewed surveys of Europa. They were looking for extraterrestrial life, which they didn't find. Some amino acid precursors, but no life. So the space turtles weren't from Europa. A brief flash of annoyance rose in her and faded. They were both tired. They were both in the only ship in an unpopulated solar system, with help weeks away at best. And she wasn't explaining herself that well. She swallowed, set her shoulders, and went on. They weren't. But maybe they were like what we're looking for. And here's the other thing, the other form of life that Terrascova missions were looking for was deep vent organisms. Those I know. Worms and things that live near volcanic vents. They use the energy from the vent instead of sunlight. And they also get a bunch of biologically interesting minerals. But yes, start talking volcanism and I know my way around. Faya said, that's what Carter's describing. That biome look. She talks about the cold above and the heat below. Like the ice shell of a water moon, with a hot core and free water in between. The part where she says she felt it starting to make more of itself. That's, I don't know, some kind of reproduction, mitosis or budding. And the thing where she tasted stones, Fire said. Minerals and nutrients floating up from below. You're thinking they're both there. These slow life turtles, jellyfish, and vent organisms, too, but lower down. Like what we were looking for on Europa. The line on his forehead erased itself. She wanted to keep going. But she knew her husband's rhythms. He was working something through, and if she talked now, he wouldn't hear her. The hum of the ship around them and the ticking of the air recycler were the only sounds until he laughed once. Like a cough. Okay, I know what I was thinking of. He said the part about the thing in the water. The handhold, yeah, that had happened after the fuck tasting stone. Seriously, I feel like we should have brought a poetry grad student along. This is bullshit as data. You were thinking of something, right? Sorry if that was some kind of impressionistic, experiential description of iron uptake, leading to magnetic navigation. Maybe that's the handhold in the water, and that thing at the end. Elvie said when something went down into the heat and came back up scarred, but with this revelatory whatever it was. If that's the slow life, intentionally reaching for a nutrient-rich environment for the initially time, seeking out food instead of just bumping into it, I think. Kara is experiencing this organism's evolutionary history. The diamond, thank you for not calling it an emerald, is displaying her how they came to exist, like if we were explaining life to something that had never seen anything like us, by pushing down into organic chemistry and building the story up from there so that we have a common context. Fires went quiet. The line on his forehead came back. Elvie pushed off the wall turning to take the edge of her workstation in her fingers and pull herself to a stop. He saw her expression and shook his head. No, it makes sense. Sort of, I see why. That would be the best information sharing strategy. And all that, it's just okay, say the proto-molecule. Engineers have gotten us up to the part of their story where they were like hamsters. Avoiding the dinosaurs, I don't mean to be an asshole, but so what? Elvie didn't know exactly what she'd been expecting him to say, but it hadn't been that. So we know something about what they are. This could be the origin of the species that established a vast galactic presence and overcame a bunch of things we always thought were laws of physics. That's a big deal. It is, I hear you, but it's so far back, sweetie. If Caro could ask the diamonds, maybe the top 5 ways to keep vast monsters from beyond space and time from killing everyone, that might be a better place to start. Only if she can understand the answer and if they knew. Which evidence suggests they didn't. I mean, that elaborate gamma ray burst, trap and Tacoma system was just them wiring a shotgun to a doorknob. Even if we know everything about the space jellyfish, is that going to be enough? They fell silent. Elvie knew the solid feeling at the center of her gut. It was always there these days. The only thing that changed was how aware of it she was. She anticipated what he would say next. What are we doing here? And her own reply. The best we can. But he surprised her. It's going to be okay. She laughed, not because she believed it, but because it was obviously untrue. And because he wanted to comfort her, and she wanted to be comforted. He took her arm, drawing her across the open desk, and pulled her beside him, his arms enfolded her. And she let herself curl against him until they were floating together. His head at her shoulder, his thighs under hers. Like twins in the same amniotic sac. It wasn't an image she thought other people would find heartwarming. But she did, and when she was alone with Fires, other people weren't important. His breath smelled like smoky tea. I'm sorry, she murmured. Baby, I'm so sorry for what? All of it, it's not your fault. She pressed her cheek to his head, felt the scratch of his hair against her cheek. Tears were sheeting across her eyes, making the office swim like she was underwater. I know, but I don't know how to fix it, and I'm supposed to. She felt the subtle expansion and collapse of his thigh. We are hailing an awful lot of Marys, aren't we? We're making progress. We already know so much more. You're right, I'm frustrated. I didn't mean to piss on the project, Fire said. If the answer is anywhere, it's here. She nodded and hoped that was true, and that the growing scent. She felt that there was something important, critical in her notes that she'd missed was right, and that whatever it was, she could find it in time. Later, when Fires had gone to get some sleep, she went through a packet of documents from Okita. The High Energy Physics Work Group had their most recent data ready for review. The latest complex modeling outputs mapped possible connections between the attack on the Typhoon, the optic and virtual particles in Tacoma system, and the initial loss of consciousness after the tempest to destroyed Palace Station, a surveying company that usually did mining operations around Jupiter, was trying to find the weird magic bullet that had been frame-locked to the Tempest. When it was destroyed, her own computational biology group was setting up a distributed study that would put subjects in NIRS imaging around the clock in every populated system, in hopes of catching good day to the next time the enemy flicked consciousness off. And all the documents were being dumped through massive virtual pattern matching arrays on Earth, Mars, Laconia, and Baragon in hopes that machine intelligence might catch something the humans had overlooked. It was the broadest, best-funded research effort in the history of the human race, 1 million people searching through a haystack. the size of 1,300 planets, and hoping there was a needle in there someplace. She sometimes wondered if this had been toward his plan. All along push and push, until solving the ring entity problem was forced into initially position for all humanity. It always held that it was a problem they'd have to solve sooner or later, and humans did tend to do their best work when survival was on the line. But whether it had been the High Council's intention or not, humanity had one problem it was trying to solve now, and James fucking Holden had somehow managed to put her in charge of it. She didn't know whether looking over the vast effort calmed her or keyed her up, maybe both. When she reached the end of the packet, she closed down her screen. There were a couple dozen things that she has. Head of the Laconian Science Directorate. Needed to authorize or comment on, and she would. But after she'd had some food and maybe a nap, if she could sleep, she pulled herself through the ship. Floating down the corridors, Kara and Zan were in the galley with Hashan. Lee and Quinn Du Buddha and Elvie watched them as she decatured herself. A bulb of lentil soup, Major Hao Chen Li said, nodding to her. She floated over, Dr. Elvie said, and took a mouthful of soup. The Falcon made good food. The lentils tasted almost trash, like nutrition and mud and comfort, even though they were probably made from textured, fungal proteins. We were just talking about Kohenji Wizard, Quinn said. It's an entertainment feed out of some of a Saturn. A system, I don't know what Elvis said, and Zan spinning slowly about his Z-axis, launched into a description of the story. It involved a hidden space station built by angels that were also human desires in physical form, and apparently there were a lot of songs, one of which Zan sang. Kara joined in for the chorus. Elvie listened and, to her surprise, felt herself beginning to relax. Sin's enthusiasm and the benign, childlike narcissism that drove him to the center of every conversation were actually a joy. For a few minutes, Elvie was out of her own head. It was easy to forget that he'd been a 7-year-old for over 40 years now. She almost regretted coming back to herself. Kara, she said, nodding toward the other side of the common room, could I borrow you for a second? The girl who wasn't a girl froze, the way that she and Zan did, sometimes suddenly going as still as stone. It only lasted an instant, but it was eerie every time. Then she nodded and pushed gently off in the direction Elvie had indicated. Elvie tossed her empty bulb in the recycler and floated over to meet her, Zan still with Quinn and Ha. Sean blinked anxious black eyes at them, and Elvie waved what she hoped was reassuringly. What's on your mind, Doc? Kara said. Her casual informality left Elvie feeling warm toward the girl. Every time she heard it, for someone who'd been imprisoned and experimented on for decades by an induced sociopath, Kara had given her trust to Elvie quickly. Couple things I wanted to see how you were feeling. The last dive there was an interesting readings. It looked like you were in a different kind of sync. With our big green friend, it was looking more like a non-local reaction than something with light delay. Yes, Kara said so quickly, it was almost interrupting. I felt that way too, and since we don't know what this is, I need you to tell me how you feel. Are you all right? I'm fine, Kara said. Going in there like this seems, I don't know, it feels good. It feels right, which Elvie knew already. She'd seen the scams and knew what the connection was doing to Kara's endorphin levels. It was anthropomorphizing to say that the BFE wanted Kara to come back. There was no reason to think it had any will or intentions, but it wanted the girl to come back. Somewhere deep in her mind, Elvie knew that what came next was a mistake, and that she'd chosen to make it, given that she said, I'd like to consider accelerating the session schedule. If we could take a day or two less between the dives, that would be great, Kara said. I don't think there's any reason not to. I can handle it. Her grin was so genuine, so human that Elvie couldn't help grinning back. All right then, I'll talk with the team. And we'll get a new protocol schedule out. Maybe we can try another run as soon as tomorrow." Caro gave a little shiver of excitement. And from across the common room, Zan frowned and looked anxious. More than anxious, melancholy. Elvie took Kara's hand, squeezing her fingers, and Kara's squeezed back. A human gesture of connection as old as the species. "It's going to be all right," Elvie said, not realizing until she heard herself that she was echoing Fires, that she hadn't believed it when he said it. "I know," Kara replied. Chapter 9 Kit. His father looked out from the screen, eyes red from happy tears. Probably Alex Kamel had wept over Kit the same way once. But Kit had been a baby then, he didn't remember it. And so seeing it now felt like the revelation of something new. "I am so proud of what you and Ro here doing, the life you put together. It's hard to understand what it means to make a family, to bring a new person into the world, but now that you have, I hope you can see that's the love we had for you. Me and your mother both, it's overwhelming. This is everything I hoped you could find, and I know that you'll be a good father. A better father than I was. Oh fuck Dad, get breathed, are we doing this again? The bad things that happened were never about you. About how much I loved you, how much I do love you. I am so full what you've done, it just leaves me feeling so full. I'm so happy for you." The message ended. It was 5 full minutes long. And Kid wasn't sure he had the stamina right now to listen to it again. It was easy for his father to romanticize Kid's life. Distance and the political dangers of their contact meant Alex could only see a small part of a very large picture. He checked the time. There wasn't much to say, and most of it wasn't something he'd want to put on Alex's shoulders anyway. If Aunt Bobby had still been alive, maybe he'd have turned to her. She'd had a way of seeing to the heart of a thing. Compassion without sentimentality. His father was carrying too much baggage for that, and kids still couldn't tell. Protecting him. He started the recording. "Hey," he said into the camera. "I want you to know that I really appreciate you coming close enough to swap these messages, close to real time. More often than not I send you something, and I just have to hope you even got it." Shit. He stopped the recording, deleted it. He didn't want this to devolve into another round of Alex whipping himself for not being more present. And Kit's adolescence, the issue carried more guilt for his father than any resentment from Kit. It was just that he had too much right now to add on. The burden of one more person's emotional well-being. But he had to say something. The door chime saved him for the moment. He dropped his calms and informed the door to unlock. His mother breezed into the apartment, the way she always did. She was a stately, strong-jawed woman who wielded the nobility of her features like a club. Kit loved her, and he always would. But he liked her more when she was on a screen. "Where's my baby?" she said with a grin. She didn't mean him. "Ro, he's changing his diaper," Kit said, gesturing toward the back room with his chin. "She be out in a minute." Rokia Giselle said, "Grandma's come to help." Rohi hated it when people not from her birth family used her full name, from the day his mother had found that out. She'd never called her anything else. Kit understood that. She meant it as a statement of love and acceptance. He also understood it was a power play. The apparent contradiction of being both things at once made sense to him in a way it didn't to Rohi, but he'd been raised with it. The dysfunctions and idiosyncrasies of childhood became the self-evident norms of adulthood. He listened to their voices, Gisel's and Rose, and the gabble and fuss. That was Bacati. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew the tones. Mother's imperiousness compensating for insecurity, Rohi's polite kindness that masked her annoyance, and the baby's vocalizations, still too new to mean anything to Kit, but his own joy and exhaustion A minute later, the three of them came out together. His mother, his wife, and his son. Giselle already had Bakari on her hip. Rohi's smile was strained but patient. "Grandma's here," his mother said. "I'm in control, you two lovelies. Go off and enjoy your date night, while I play with my perfect baby boy. We'll be back after dinner," Kit said. "Don't hurry," Giselle said with an airy wave. Rohi's eye roll was so small it was almost subliminal. Kit bowed to his mother, kissed his confused son on the top of his head, with the bones hadn't yet fused, and then he and Rohi walked out to the public corridor and closed the door behind them. The last thing he heard was Bakari starting to wail. As he realized they were leaving, "Date night?" Rohi asked. As they walked down toward the local hub, it was easier than. "Rohi and I need to have an uninterrupted conversation." Kit said it would have been half an hour of her telling me why divorce is bad. This way there was no lecture. He had hoped she would laugh, but her nod was sharp, short, and businesslike. She didn't take his arm, and her gaze stayed locked on the walkway before them. The common corridor was bright, and the plants on the median shifted, their broad leaves in the breeze of the recyclers. They'd taken positions at Adipole on Mars, with the understanding that it was both a center of research, second in the Sol system only to Earth, and a more congenial place for pregnancy than any of the deeper stations, except maybe Ganymede. Giselle had been delighted, and Rohi had too. At first, they came to the Noodle Bar. That had been their habitual off-shift hangout. A young individual with an untreated acne problem, and Adambra sat in a little daze, plucking a gentle melody, and being ignored by the people eating at the tables. Kit sat bro. He sat across from him, and they ignored the music too. "Do you want to order first?" Kit said, careful to keep his voice neutral. "Yes, bro," he said. It didn't take more than an instant to key their preferences into the table and have the system confirm them. They sat in silence for the 3 minutes before old Jandal came out with their bowls. Lemongrass and egg roll for him, cum chin ka for her. That she'd ordered one of her comfort foods meant something to him. Jandal nodded to them both, missing the tension or else ignoring it, and went back to the kitchen. Rohi leaned in over her bowl. "Well," Kid said, "what's on your mind?" "Hear me out, all right." He nodded her on. "I think we should look at postponing the contract again." Rohi, "No. Hear me out." She waited until she was sure he'd be quiet. "I know Mars is only 1/3 of AG, but it's a consistent third. Always on gravity is really important in the initially few months of development. His inner ear is still forming. His bone growth is starting. He'll be going through a lot of fundamental changes. In the next year, and even if we're on one of the fast ships, we'll still be on the float for months. I don't want him to grow up with any of the low gravity syndromes. I don't want to start his life by changing his body and ways that give him fewer options later on. Not if I don't have to." "I hear what you're saying. I've looked at the schedule. There's 3 other parts of the team who could take our berth on the price. We'd still be in the date range if we switched to going out in the Nakamati, assuming we got on it," Kit said. "I'm not saying don't ever do it, bro." He said, "I'm not saying cancel the contract. That's not what I meant." A fat, slow tear drifted down her cheek, and she wiped it away like it betrayed her. Kit took a deep breath and let it out. When he spoke carefully. "You're crying." "Yeah, well, I'm scared." "What are you scared of?" She looked at him incredulous. Like the answer was obvious. It was. But he thought it was crucial for her to say it out loud anyway. "I'm suggesting that you compromise your career." She said that she'd said your career, not our careers, was everything. Kit thought he'd understood the dynamic between them, and now he knew he was right. The corners of her mouth tugged down, and he could see for a moment what she looked like as a child, long before he met her. "Okay," he said, My turn. She nodded. Here's the initially thing, he said. I'm not my father and I'm not your mother's. I'm not going to make the decisions they made. You and Bakari are my initially choice every time. I'm not going to leave, even if it means cutting off a career path. He took her hand. Hear me out. She nodded. The next tear she ignored. I know this isn't the perfect time, he said. But there's never going to be a perfect time. There will always be something, but Carrie's development or my mother's health, or a conference we won't be able to come back for, or something. There's always something, until Laconia decides to start another war, to prove a point, or the aliens kill us all. I can't control any of that, Kid said. All I can do is keep acting. Like the universe is going to keep existing, and planning for a future in it. Newest dad is 1 point to G. It's going to be hard on him and us too. Jacob and Black Combined Capital is a good company, doing the kind of work we want to do, but that doesn't mean we have to do it. We can break the contract and find something else, or we can go and do the best we can if we go. There are a lot of good programs for helping kids and babies with gravity transitions, and I'll get up to go to the gym with you every day. If you want, if we stay here, there are other jobs. We can do anything, but we're going to be doing it together. Roe's eyes were red now, and she whipped the tears away with her napkin. This is stupid. Kit took her hand. You get scared when we talk about balancing the family and work. And it's okay that you do. I get it, and I love you. And a good cry is just part of the way. We talk about this stuff, and you never judge me. When it's my turn to be the weepy one, I just don't want to mess things up. She said, what if we mess things up for him? Kit stroked her knuckles with his thumb, the way he did when she couldn't sleep. Although no one's perfect, everyone's carrying something that their parents would have done differently, if they'd known, or if they'd been better people, or if things had just been different. That's all right, it's normal. Part of why I am what I am is all the bad choices my mom and dad made, and if they'd done differently, they'd still have made some mistakes somewhere along the line, and those would be part of me instead. They weren't perfect, and we aren't perfect. He is though, bro, he said. Bakati is. He is, isn't he? They were quiet for a little while. Jando came out and offered to take their leftovers away when Kit shook his head. The old individual shrugged and puttered back to the kitchen. Eventually Rohi hauled in a breath, and when she sighed she folded forward. When she spoke her voice had lost its tightness. All right, thank you. Don't say I'm sorry I didn't. You were about to. She smiled and you could see the storm had passed. I was about to. He sucked up a mouthful of noodles and chewed. The lemongrass tasted real, and the noodles were soft and salty. If they'd gone a little cold, he didn't care. Roaz sighed and relaxed into a chair. After dinner they walked home slowly. She took his hand and he leaned against her for a while. It was almost like they were courting again. Only deeper, richer, fuller. This was the life that both of their parental groups had given up. And Kit didn't understand any of them at all. At the rooms Giselle was positioned on, the couch spooling through entertainment, news feeds on her handheld. As they came in she lifted a finger to her lips and pointed toward the nursery. He fell asleep 10 minutes ago. She said ate well, shout out his body weight, giggled. Played, cried for 15 seconds and out. Thank you, Mama, Kid said. And Giselle stood up and wrapped him in her arms. It's not for you, she said quietly enough that only he could hear. I'm soaking in all the grandbaby I can while I have him. Stirring up for winter. After she left, Rohi went to her office, walking softly to keep from waking the baby. And he sat at his own desk and pulled up his message queue. He started the camera. Hey Dad, I love you too. Thank you for coming close enough to send the message. I know how hard that can be, and I love you for it. Having a kid is the scariest thing I've ever done. And I love it. I love having a kid. I love being a dad. I know you and Mom didn't have things go the way you'd have picked, but no matter what happened, I always knew you cared about me. I learned that from you. If that's the only thing I managed to pass on, it'll be worth it. It's a great legacy. Seriously, the best. He tried to think of something more, but exhaustion was seeping in at the corners of his brain, and he didn't really know what else there was to say. He reviewed it, sent it, scrubbed his system the way he always did when he'd gotten something from the Underground's network, then showered and got ready for bed. Rowie wasn't there. He found her standing over the crib, looking down at the new little life they'd made together. But Carrie's soft round belly rose and fell as he slept. Kit stood there with her and with him. He's a strong little guy, isn't he? Well, he said he is, and his parents love him. Okay, then let's go. Chapter 10 Fires, Planetary Geology. Wasn't the sort of degree people usually went into, looking for a career as a kingmaker. There wasn't a lot of crossover between freshmen. Analysis of sedimentary patterns and having people vie for your influence over issues of life and death. Add in political sway over a galaxy-spanning empire, and the overlap was pretty narrow. But without intending to, Fees had stumbled into it. He was floating in Lee's personal cabin, with a bone-colored bulb of whiskey in one hand. It was a thick, pitty distillation that was too harsh for him. When they were under thrust, a couple weeks on, the float did something to deaden his taste buds, and so at times like this it was perfect. Lee Elvis, second in command, was queuing up a message from home, or at least from Laconia, which despite having lived there for years, Fees still didn't think of as home. Here, Lee said, pushing back from his station. Okay, who am I looking at? Fire has said his name is Galawan Audadine, Lee said. He's a senior researcher and extrapolative physics. Right, so I'm not going to understand this at all, am I? I informed him to give you the educated layman's version. The screen flipped to an image of a thin-faced man with a vast and well-trimmed beard and a colorless formal shirt. He nodded to the camera and not quite a bow. Thank you for your time, Dr. Circus. I want you to know how much I appreciate it. Since it was a recording fireside, I wanted to share with you some thoughts my work group has put together. I think you will find them very promising, the thin-faced individual said, then visibly gathered himself. His expression settled into the thing Fires expected on grade school teachers, who were trying to be approachable. Light, I'm sure you know, is a membrane phenomenon on the surface of time. Fires drained the bulb of the last drop of whiskey and put his hand out for another. Lee had it ready,